Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we explore the complete story of the Siege of Orgrimmar, one of the most pivotal events in World of Warcraft history. This is the tale of how a warchief's madness brought both Alliance and Horde to the gates of their enemy's capital, united against a common threat. The story of the Siege of Orgrimmar is not simply about a battle. It is about the corruption of power, the breaking of bonds, and ultimately the redemption that comes when former enemies stand together against tyranny. To understand what brought the combined forces of Azeroth to lay siege to the Orcish capital, we must first understand the orc who sat upon the throne within its walls. Garrosh Hellscream was born on the orcish homeworld of Draenor, the son of the legendary warrior Garrosh Hellscream, chieftain of the Warsong clan. However, Garrosh never knew his father during his formative years. When the orcs drank the blood of the Pit Lord Manaroth and became slaves to the Burning Legion's bloodlust, Garrosh Hellscream was among the first to partake. The demonic corruption spread through the orcish clans like wildfire, transforming them into the savage horde that would eventually invade Azeroth through the dark portal. But Garrosh was left behind. Afflicted with the red pox, a debilitating illness that left him too weak to join his people in their conquest, the young orc remained in the village of Garadar in Nagrand. The red pox was a wasting disease that sapped strength and vitality, leaving its victims weak and vulnerable. For a young orc who should have been learning to fight, who should have been testing himself against the challenges of youth, the illness was a prison of flesh. Garadar itself was a village of the Maghar, those orcs who had escaped the demonic corruption by remaining on Draenor. They had not drunk the blood of Manaroth. They had not felt the blood rage that drove their corrupted kin to war. They had watched, helpless, as their brothers and sisters became something monstrous, and they had been left behind when those monsters marched through the dark portal to conquer another world. There, Garrosh grew up hearing tales of his father's actions, of how Grom had been the first to drink the demon blood, of how the Hellscream name had become synonymous with the corruption that had destroyed their people. The elders of Garadar spoke of Grommash with a mixture of sorrow and condemnation. He had been a great chieftain once, they said, a warrior of legendary skill and courage, but he had led his people into darkness. He had been the first to sell their souls for power. Whatever Grom had been before, the moment he drank Manaroth's blood, he became a cautionary tale, a warning about what happened when ambition overwhelmed wisdom. The shame weighed heavily upon young Garrosh. He believed himself the son of a monster, the heir to a legacy of dishonor. Every time he looked at his reflection, he saw his father's features staring back at him. Every time he heard his own name, he heard the echoes of his father's crimes. The other Maghar treated him with a mixture of pity and wariness, uncertain whether the son might share the father's weakness, whether the corruption that had claimed Grom might somehow manifest in his offspring. For years, Garrosh wallowed in this despair. He refused to take up the mantle of leadership that was his birthright. He sat in Garadar, consumed by self-loathing, convinced that the sins of his father were his own to bear. The other Maghar orcs, those who had escaped the corruption by remaining on Draenor, looked to him for guidance, but he gave them none. He was paralyzed by shame, unable to see past the darkness he believed defined him. everything changed when Thrall came to Outland. The Warchief of the New Horde had traveled through the Dark Portal during the Burning Crusade, seeking to reconnect with the Orcish homeland and find answers about his people's past. When Thrall arrived in Nagrand and met Garrosh, he found not a proud warrior, but a broken young orc drowning in guilt over crimes he had never committed. Thrall saw something in Garrosh that the young orc could not see in himself. He saw potential, strength, and a fire that had been smothered by misplaced shame. The former slave who had risen to lead his people recognized in Garrosh a kindred spirit, someone whose circumstances had tried to define him, but who possessed the inner strength to become something more. Thrall had himself grown up in captivity, raised by humans who viewed him as a monster, and he had overcome that beginning to become one of the most respected leaders on Azeroth. He believed Garrosh could do the same, and so Thrall told Garrosh the truth about his father. Yes, Grom had been the first to drink the demon blood. Yes, his actions had set his people on a path of destruction. But that was not the end of Garrosh Hellscream's story. Thrall spoke of what had happened in the forests of Ashenvale during the Third War, when the orcs had arrived on Kalimdor seeking a new homeland. He told of how the blood curse had returned through Manaroth's machinations, of how the Warsong clan had once again fallen under demonic influence. But Garrosh Hellscream had not surrendered to that corruption a second time. When he learned of what his clan had become, of the atrocities they were committing under the Blood Rage's influence, he was filled with righteous fury. He tracked down the Pit Lord Manaroth, the demon whose blood had cursed his people, and he challenged the creature to single combat. The battle was brutal, desperate, seemingly hopeless. Manaroth was a demon lord of immense power, while Grom was a mortal orc who had been corrupted and weakened by his previous submission to the blood curse. But Garrosh Hellscream found strength in his determination to right his wrongs. With a mighty blow of his axe Gorehowl, the weapon that would one day be wielded by his son, Grom struck Manaroth down. The Pit Lord's death caused a massive explosion of fell energy that mortally wounded Grom himself. But as he lay dying, Grom knew that his sacrifice had achieved something that all his previous battles never could. He had freed the orcs from their blood curse forever. Every orc on Azeroth, every green-skinned survivor of the demonic corruption, owed their freedom to Garrosh Hellscream's final act. Thrall showed Garrosh a vision of this battle, a spiritual reenactment conjured through the power of the elements and the memories of those who had witnessed it. Garrosh watched his father's final moments, saw the courage and determination that had driven Grom to sacrifice everything. He saw a hero, not a monster. He saw redemption, not damnation. The revelation transformed Garrosh. The shame that had imprisoned him for so long shattered, replaced by fierce pride. His father was not a villain, but a hero. The Hellscream name was not a mark of dishonor, but a banner of redemption. Garrosh embraced this new understanding with the same intensity he had once embraced his despair. He would honor his father's legacy. He would prove himself worthy of the Hellscream name. Thrall invited Garrosh to return to Azeroth and serve the Horde. The young Hellscream accepted eagerly, hungry to prove himself in battle. His first major test came during the war against the Lich King in Northrend. Garrosh led Horde forces with ferocity and tactical brilliance, earning victories at places like the Wrathgate and throughout the Frozen Continent. His warriors loved him. They saw in him the spirit of the old horde, the pride and strength that had made their ancestors feared across two worlds. But there were concerns even then. Garrosh's aggression sometimes bordered on recklessness. His hatred for the Alliance, particularly after the tragedy at the Wrathgate, where both Horde and Alliance forces were betrayed by the Forsaken Renegade, Grand Apothecary Putris, seemed to burn hotter than strategic wisdom would allow. He clashed repeatedly with other Horde leaders, particularly Vol'jin of the Darkspear Trolls, whose more measured approach to conflict Garrosh viewed as weakness. When the cataclysm struck Azeroth, and Thrall stepped down as Warchief to join the Earthen Ring in their efforts to heal the wounded world, he made a decision that would shape the future of the Horde for years to come. The world was breaking apart. Deathwing, the corrupted dragon aspect of Earth, had burst from his prison in Deepholm and shattered the very foundations of Azeroth. Earthquakes devastated cities. Tidal waves drowned coastlines. The elemental planes themselves were in chaos, their inhabitants raging against the mortal world they had long been separated from. Thrall was one of the most powerful shaman on Azeroth. His connection to the elements was legendary, his ability to calm and communicate with them unmatched. The Earthen Ring, the order of shaman dedicated to maintaining the balance between the elemental forces, needed him desperately. Without his leadership, without his power, they feared they could not stabilize the world that Deathwing had so thoroughly damaged. But the Horde also needed leadership. Thrall could not be in both places at once, could not serve as both Warchief and Savior of the world. He had to choose, and he chose to save Azeroth. But that meant naming a successor, someone who could lead the Horde through the chaos of the cataclysm, someone strong enough to command respect and decisive enough to act when action was needed. He named Garrosh Hellscream as his successor. Many were shocked by the choice. Vol'jin openly questioned it, confronting Thrall in private and warning him that Garrosh would lead the Horde to ruin. The Troll Chieftain had observed Garrosh closely during the Northrend campaign. He had seen the aggression that bordered on recklessness, the arrogance that refused to acknowledge other perspectives, the obsession with Orcish glory that seemed to dismiss the contributions of the Horde's other races. Garrosh was not ready, Vol'jin argued. He lacked the wisdom to temper his strength, the patience to build rather than merely conquer. Cairn Bloodhoof, the venerable leader of the Tauren, had similar concerns. The ancient High Chieftain had been one of the Horde's founding members, had stood beside Thrall when the new Horde was forged on Kalimdor. He had watched generations come and go, had seen leaders rise and fall. In Garrosh, he saw danger. The young orc was too focused on martial glory, too quick to dismiss the diplomatic approaches that had allowed the Horde to survive and even thrive in a hostile world. When Garrosh's aggressive policies led to a skirmish that killed Tauren druids, Cairn could no longer remain silent. He challenged Garrosh to a Mak'gora, a traditional orcish duel of honor, over the direction of the Horde. It was a challenge that Garrosh could not refuse without losing face among his own people. That duel ended in tragedy. Unbeknownst to Garrosh, his weapon Gorehowl had been poisoned by the Grim Totem Elder, Magatha Earthfury. When his blade cut Cairn, the poison weakened the old Tauren, and Garrosh struck the killing blow. Though Garrosh had not known of the treachery, the death of Cairn created a rift between him and the Tauren that would never fully heal. Bane Bloodhoof, Cairn's son, became the new High Chieftain and harbored deep suspicions about the new Warchief. As Warchief, Garrosh's vision for the Horde became increasingly clear. He dreamed of Orcish supremacy, of a Horde dominated by Orc culture and Orc values. The other races of the Horde were tolerated, even useful, but they were not equals in Garrosh's eyes. He began to marginalize non-Orc voices in the leadership, filling positions of power with loyal Orcs who shared his vision of a pure, strong Horde. His military campaigns reflected this philosophy. Garrosh launched aggressive expansions into Alliance territory, seeking to claim resources and land for his people. He was not interested in the tenuous peace that had existed since the Third War. He wanted conquest. He wanted to prove that the Horde was the dominant power on Azeroth. The destruction of Theramore marked a turning point in Garrosh's reign and in the conflict between Alliance and Horde. Theramore was a human port city on the eastern coast of Kalimdor, founded by Jaina Proudmoore after the Third War as a bastion of hope for peaceful coexistence between the factions. For years it had stood as proof that Alliance and Horde could live as neighbors without constant warfare. Garrosh saw it differently. To him, Theramore was a dagger pointed at the heart of Durotar, an Alliance stronghold on what should be Horde territory. Its very existence was an insult, a reminder that the Alliance thought they could plant their flag wherever they pleased. He resolved to remove that dagger permanently. The assault on Theramore was brutal but conventional at first. Horde forces laid siege to the city, and the Alliance rushed reinforcements to defend it. Jaina Proudmoore, now one of the most powerful mages in Azeroth, coordinated the defense alongside Admiral Tarlin Aubrey, General Marcus Jonathan, and the Archmage Ronan. The leadership of the Kirin Tor itself had come to Theramore, recognizing the strategic importance of the city and the need to demonstrate solidarity with the Alliance. Ronan, the leader of the Kirin Tor, had brought nearly a dozen of his most powerful mages with him. He was accompanied by his wife, Varisa Windrunner, sister to the Ranger General Sylvanas and the Ranger Alaria. Ronan was a hero of the war against the Lich King, a mage of tremendous skill who had proven himself in countless battles. His presence gave the defenders hope that they could hold against whatever Garrosh threw at them. They believed they could hold the city against the Horde assault. The walls were strong, the defenders were skilled. The reinforcements that had been rushed to the city included some of the Alliance's most capable warriors and spellcasters. They had prepared for a siege, had stocked supplies and fortified positions. They were ready for a battle. They were wrong, but not in the way they expected. Garrosh had no intention of winning through a prolonged siege. The Warchief had studied the Alliance's likely responses, had anticipated that they would rush their best warriors to defend such an important target. That was precisely what he wanted. The entire ground assault was a feint designed to draw Alliance military leaders and reinforcements into the city. When the defenders were concentrated within Theramore's walls, when the greatest heroes of the Alliance were gathered in one place, Garrosh sprung his true trap. Bane Bloodhoof and Vol'jin had learned of Garrosh's true plan, and they were horrified. The Warchief had never intended for his forces to take Theramore through conventional warfare. He had sent them to die, to serve as bait in a scheme of unprecedented destruction. The Tauren High Chieftain secretly sent a messenger to warn Jaina of what was coming, but the warning came too late to save those already within the city. A goblin zeppelin flew over the city carrying a mana bomb, a weapon of devastating magical power. The bomb had been augmented with the focusing iris, a powerful artifact stolen from the blue dragonflight. The focusing iris was one of the most powerful magical objects in existence, capable of concentrating and directing arcane energy on a massive scale. In its normal use, it helped regulate the flow of magic in the world. Garrosh's engineers had perverted it into a weapon of mass destruction. When the mana bomb detonated, the explosion was catastrophic. Kalecgos, the blue dragon who had become leader of his dragonflight after the death of Malygos, sensed the focusing iris's power as the bomb descended. He tried to stop it, to intercept the weapon before it could reach its target, but he was too late. The bomb was already falling, already channeling the accumulated arcane energy into a single devastating blast. Ronan, the leader of the Kirin Tor, understood what was happening in the last moments before the detonation. He knew that Jaina's tower was saturated with magical wards and enchantments, decades of protective spells woven into its very stones. He realized that if the blast could be centered there, the wards might absorb and contain some of its power, might reduce the devastation enough to give at least some of the defenders a chance to survive. In those final seconds, Ronan made a choice. He called the mana bomb to himself, using his own mastery of arcane magic to draw the falling weapon toward Jaina's tower. He pushed Jaina through a portal, sending her to safety even as he sacrificed himself to redirect the blast. His last words were that she was the future of the Kirin Tor, a prophecy that had been revealed to him by his friend Crassus, the red dragon who had been consort to the lifebinder Alexstrasza. The blast vaporized everything within its radius. Ronan's sacrifice had contained some of the blast's power, had prevented it from being even worse than it was, but even his heroic effort could only do so much. Theramore was annihilated. Thousands died in an instant. General Marcus Jonathan, Admiral Tarlin Aubrey, Jaina's young apprentice Kindi, and countless others were simply erased from existence. Their bodies were not left to be buried. There was nothing left of them at all. Jaina Proudmoore survived only because she had been teleported away at the last moment. When she returned to see what remained of her city, she found nothing but a crater of arcane-scarred earth. The bodies of her friends, her soldiers, the innocent civilians who had trusted her to protect, them all were gone, erased from existence by Garrosh's weapon of mass destruction. The destruction of Theramore changed Jaina fundamentally. The woman who had dedicated her life to peace, who had allowed her own father to die rather than reignite war between Alliance and Horde, was transformed by grief and rage. Her hair turned white from the arcane radiation. Her heart turned cold toward the Horde. She would never again be the advocate for peace she once was. Garrosh had not just destroyed a city. He had destroyed the last best hope for reconciliation between the factions. The Alliance reeled from the loss, but their shock turned to fury. King Varian Wrynn, who had his own complicated history with the Horde and had been moving toward a more peaceful stance, was pushed back toward war. The destruction of Theramore united the Alliance in outrage. They demanded justice for the atrocity. Within the Horde, reactions were mixed. Some, particularly those orcs who shared Garrosh's vision of supremacy, celebrated the victory. But many others were horrified. The Tauren, with their reverence for life and balance, found the indiscriminate slaughter unconscionable. The trolls saw it as the action of a madman. Even some orcs questioned whether this was truly honor, whether their ancestors would have approved of such tactics. But to voice such concerns openly was dangerous. Garrosh did not tolerate dissent. The warchief's attention turned next to Pandaria. When the mists shrouding that ancient continent parted and its existence was revealed to the world, both Alliance and Horde rushed to explore its shores. Garrosh saw in Pandaria new resources to fuel his war machine, new power to claim for the Horde. He dispatched expedition after expedition, ordering them to bring back anything of value. But Pandaria was not like other lands. The continent had been hidden for 10,000 years, protected from the outside world. In that time, a unique balance had developed. The negative emotions of its inhabitants did not simply dissipate as they did elsewhere. They manifested physically as the Shah, dark entities born from the final death breath of the old god Y'Sharj, who had been slain by the Titans in Azeroth's ancient past. The arrival of the Alliance and Horde, with their hatred, their fear, their doubt, their pride, awakened the Shah in ways the Pandaren had not seen in generations. The conflict between the factions fed the dark entities, making them stronger, spreading their corruption across the land. The Pandaren, who had spent millennia learning to control their emotions and keep the Shah contained, watched in horror as outsiders undid everything they had built. Garrosh cared nothing for the warnings of the Pandaren. He saw only power. When his forces discovered information about the Mogu, the ancient race that had once ruled Pandaria through tyranny and dark magic, he became fascinated. The Mogu had created armies of stone, had bent entire peoples to their will, had achieved the kind of absolute dominion that Garrosh himself dreamed of. He wanted their secrets. The Divine Bell was one such secret. This ancient Mogu artifact had the power to harness and focus Shah energy, to use negative emotions as a weapon. The bell had been created during the reign of the Thunder King Lei Shen, when the Mogu ruled Pandaria with an iron fist. The Korune spellweavers, masters of dark magic, had forged the bell from the flesh of a Titan-forged being, shaped it with the fire of stars, and bound it with the breath of darkest shadow. When rung, the bell could shake the very earth and call forth the hidden anger within the hearts of all who heard it. Lei Shen had used the divine bell to strengthen his armies, to awaken their fury and drive them to feats of martial prowess that would otherwise be impossible. The bell's screaming voice struck fear and doubt into the hearts of his enemies, even as it filled his own soldiers with unstoppable rage. It was one of the most dangerous artifacts ever created, a weapon that could turn any army into an avalanche of destruction. Garrosh dispatched his most elite forces to find it, racing against the Alliance, who sought to keep such dangerous power out of his hands. The Night Elves of Darnassus had discovered the bell first, had moved it to their capital for study and safekeeping. But Horde agents infiltrated the city and stole the artifact, spiriting it away to Garrosh's waiting hands. The theft was an act of war in itself, a violation of the sanctity of the Night Elves' most sacred city. The search led across Pandaria, through ancient ruins and forgotten vaults, until finally the divine bell was secured for the Horde. Garrosh's experiments with the divine bell were conducted in the depths beneath Orgrimmar, in chambers carved from the living rock where his darkest works could be hidden from prying eyes. He gathered orc volunteers, warriors willing to be transformed in service to their warchief. Using the bell's power, he attempted to infuse them with Sha energy to create soldiers of unprecedented strength who had mastered negative emotions rather than being controlled by them. The ceremony was terrible to witness. The divine bell would be rung, its discordant tones filling the chamber with vibrations that seemed to reach into the very souls of those present. The orc volunteers would begin to shake, their eyes rolling back as the Sha energy responded to the bell's call. Dark tendrils would emerge from their bodies, manifestations of their suppressed rage and hatred given physical form. The results were mixed at best. Most who underwent the process were overwhelmed. The Sha energy consumed them, turning them into mindless engines of destruction who had to be put down by their own comrades. Their bodies twisted into monstrous shapes, their minds shattered by the power they had tried to contain. The chambers beneath Orgrimmar became slaughterhouses, filled with the bodies of orcs who had believed they were serving their warchief. But Garrosh refused to abandon the experiments. He was convinced that with enough subjects, with enough refinement of the process, he could create the ultimate warriors. Each failure was merely a lesson, each death merely the cost of progress. He pushed his researchers harder, demanded new approaches, new techniques. The Kor'kron who served him began to fear being selected for the next round of experiments, knowing that their chances of survival were slim. Prince Anduin Wrynn, the young son of King Varian, who had come to Pandaria seeking wisdom from its people, attempted to stop Garrosh. The prince was unlike his father in many ways. Where Varian was a warrior who solved problems with his blade, Anduin was drawn to the ways of the light, to healing and diplomacy. He had traveled to Pandaria against his father's wishes, believing that he could learn something valuable from the Pandarans' ancient wisdom about maintaining balance and inner peace. Anduin had studied under Chiji the Red Crane, one of the 4 August Celestials who watched over Pandaria. The Celestial had taught him about hope, about the power of belief to overcome even the darkest circumstances. Anduin had also learned about the Sha, about how negative emotions could manifest as physical threats if not properly managed, so he understood the danger of what Garrosh was attempting better than most, understood that the divine bell could unleash horrors that even the warchief did not anticipate. The young prince sought a way to stop Garrosh without violence, true to his nature. He learned of the harmonic mallet, an artifact created by the Pandaran rebels in ancient times to counter the divine bell. The mallet could transform the bell's destructive harmonics into pure harmony, could neutralize its dark power and render it useless. Anduin quested across Pandaria to find the mallet's pieces, which had been scattered and hidden to prevent them from falling into Mogu hands. When Anduin confronted the warchief in the chamber where the divine bell hung, he was alone and unarmed except for the harmonic mallet. Garrosh was in the midst of yet another experiment, watching as his Kor'kron volunteers writhed under the bell's influence. Anduin struck the bell with the mallet, and the discordant tones transformed into pure, cleansing harmony. The Sha energy dissipated, The Kor'kron collapsed, freed from the dark power that had been consuming them. Garrosh's response was brutal. Enraged that this human child had disrupted his work, the warchief struck at Anduin with all his considerable strength. His blow hit the divine bell itself, shattering the ancient artifact. The massive bell crumbled, its fragments crashing down upon Anduin. The prince's bones were shattered by the falling debris. He lay crushed beneath the weight of the bell's remains, barely clinging to life. Garrosh left Anduin for dead, laughing at what he saw as the price of the Alliance's continued defiance. The warchief felt no remorse for nearly killing a child. In his mind, Anduin had interfered with his rightful pursuit of power. The prince was lucky that Garrosh had not finished him off personally. But Anduin survived, rescued by Alliance agents who had followed him to the chamber. The healers who tended to him said it was a miracle he lived at all. His body was broken in dozens of places. The recovery would take months, would require the most powerful healing magic available. Even then, there was no guarantee he would ever fully recover. The attack on Anduin further hardened Alliance resolve. King Varian, who had always been protective of his only son, was consumed with rage when he learned what Garrosh had done. The High King of the Alliance had tried to maintain some semblance of restraint in his dealings with the Horde, had held back from the total war that some of his advisors advocated. But the near murder of his child was more than he could overlook. Another crime had been added to the growing list of Garrosh's atrocities, another wound that would have to be answered. But the divine bell was only a prelude. Garrosh's true ambition led him to something far more dangerous. The bell had been destroyed, but the warchief's hunger for power remained unsatisfied. He needed something greater, something that would give him the strength to crush all opposition and reshape the world according to his vision. The Vale of Eternal Blossoms was the heart of Pandaria, a sacred valley of golden flowers and crystalline pools that had been tended by the Pandaren for generations. It was a place of profound spiritual significance, one of the Titan facilities where life itself had been nurtured in Azeroth's earliest days. At its center stood the great Mogushan Palace, and beneath it lay secrets that had been buried for millennia. Garrosh's forces had been excavating throughout Pandaria, searching for Mogu artifacts and any other source of power they could find. In the depths beneath the veil, a goblin team under Kor'kron's supervision discovered something extraordinary, a vault of Titan origin, sealed and hidden since the age of the old gods, and within that vault they found the heart of Y'Sharj. Y'Sharj was unique among the old gods. While Sithun, Yogg-Saron, and N'Zoth had all been imprisoned by the Titans, Y'Sharj had been killed. When the Titan Aman'Thul reached down and tore the old god from the surface of Azeroth, the violence of the act wounded the world soul itself. The Titans realized they could not simply destroy the remaining old gods without killing Azeroth, so they resorted to imprisonment instead. But Y'Sharj was already dead, or so it seemed. As Y'Sharj died, its last breath gave birth to the 7 Prime Shah, echoes of negative emotion that would plague Pandaria for ages to come. And its heart, the core of its being, did not simply cease to exist. It was placed in a vault, sealed away, its corrupting influence contained but not eliminated. For 10,000 years it waited, dormant but not dead, dreaming dark dreams in its prison. When Garrosh learned what his excavators had found, he went to the Vale personally. The construct Norishan, a Titan Watcher assigned to guard the vault, attempted to stop him. The Shadowpan, elite Pandaren warriors who had protected the continent for generations, tried to intervene. Lord Taranju, leader of the Shadowpan, confronted Garrosh directly, pleading with him to understand the danger of what he sought. Garrosh defeated them all. He was a warrior of tremendous skill, wielding Gorehowl with the same deadly precision his father had shown. When Taranju stood in his way, Garrosh struck him down, choking him with chains and impaling him upon his weapon. The Shadowpan leader survived barely, but he was left grievously wounded, with no one left to stop him. Garrosh took the heart of Y'Sharj, but the heart was dormant, its power sleeping after so many millennia. Garrosh needed to awaken it, and so he carried it to the sacred pools of the Vale, the waters that had nurtured life since the time of the Titans, and he submerged the heart within them. The result was catastrophic. As the heart absorbed the energy of the pools, it awakened. Dark power exploded outward, corrupting everything it touched. The golden flowers withered and died. The crystalline waters turned black with Sha energy. The spirits of the Golden Lotus Pandaren, who had tended the Vale for generations, were torn from their bodies and bound to an eternal nightmare of failure and despair. The Sha of Pride, the most powerful and dangerous of the 7 prime Sha, manifested fully for the first time in 10,000 years. The destruction of the Vale was complete. What had been a paradise of life and beauty became a wasteland of corruption and death. The Pandaren were devastated. This was more than the loss of a sacred place. It was the murder of their spiritual heart, the desecration of everything their civilization held dear, and it had been done by an outsider, by someone they had welcomed to their shores, all in pursuit of power. Garrosh did not care about the Vale. He had what he wanted. The heart of Y'Sharj was his now, awakened and pulsing with old god power. He took it back to Orgrimmar, to a secret compound beneath the city that had been prepared for this moment. There, in chambers carved from the rock of Ragefire Chasm, he would conduct experiments that made his work with the divine bell seem trivial by comparison. He called his new force the True Horde. These were orcs who had been infused with the power of Y'Sharj, their bodies transformed, their strength multiplied beyond natural limits. Unlike the failed experiments with the divine bell, the power of the heart itself was enough to create stable transformations. The warriors of the True Horde were fearsome beyond anything that had come before. Garrosh also invited allies who shared his vision or who served powers that aligned with his goals. The Klaxi, an ancient order of the Mantid race who had aided adventurers against the corrupted Empress Shek'Zir, made a choice that surprised many. They had always served Y'Sharj, they revealed. Their cooperation with outsiders had been merely practical. Now that the heart of their god was awakened, their true allegiance was clear. The paragons of the Klaxi, their greatest champions, went to Orgrimmar to serve Garrosh. The Blackfuse Company, a goblin engineering firm led by the brilliant and ruthless siegecrafter Blackfuse, also joined the True Horde. They brought with them war machines of unprecedented destructive capability, weapons that combined goblin ingenuity with technologies scavenged from Titan facilities across Pandaria. The Iron Juggernaut, a massive scorpion-like construct, was their masterpiece. The Dragonmaw clan, led by warlord Zayla, pledged their loyalty as well. Zayla had a personal connection to Garrosh. He had supported her rise to power within her clan, had helped her overthrow the brutal Morgor. She remembered that debt and was willing to repay it with the lives of her warriors. She brought her clan's proto-Drake riders to defend Orgrimmar's harbors. Malkorok, an orc of the Blackrock clan who had once served under Rend Blackhand in the Dark Horde, became Garrosh's most trusted enforcer. Where others might hesitate or question, Malkorok was absolute in his loyalty. He believed in Garrosh's vision completely and was willing to do anything to see it realized. He rooted out dissent within Orgrimmar, using intimidation, imprisonment, and murder to ensure that all opposition was silenced. When Garrosh needed a volunteer to be infused with Y'Sharja's power directly, Malkorok stepped forward without hesitation. But for all his power, for all his allies, Garrosh had made a critical miscalculation. He believed that strength alone would secure his rule, that fear would keep his enemies at bay and his subjects in line. He did not understand that he had finally pushed too far, that even within the Horde there were limits to what would be tolerated. The Darkspear Rebellion began in the shadows of Sen'jin Village, in the very homeland of the Trolls who had been among the Horde's founding members. Vol'jin had opposed Garrosh from the beginning. He had warned Thrall that making Garrosh Warchief was a mistake. He had watched as his warnings came true, as Garrosh marginalized non-orcs, as he launched increasingly brutal campaigns, as he turned the Horde into something Vol'jin no longer recognized. The Troll Chieftain's opposition had nearly cost him his life. At Domination Point, the Horde's forward base in Pandaria, Vol'jin had openly criticized Garrosh's decisions regarding the war against the Alliance. The Warchief's response was immediate and brutal. He ordered Vol'jin's assassination, disguising it as a mission with Kor'kron escorts who were actually executioners. Only Vol'jin's cunning and the intervention of adventurers who discovered the plot saved his life. Wounded and betrayed, Vol'jin had retreated to recover among the Pandaren. The Shadowpan monk Chen Stormstout, whom Vol'jin had met during the early days of the Pandaria campaign, helped the Troll Chieftain through his darkest hours. Chen had his own reasons to oppose Garrosh, having witnessed firsthand the destruction the Warchief had wrought upon his homeland. The two formed a bond of friendship that would prove crucial in the battles to come. When Vol'jin returned to Durotar, he found his people under martial law. Garrosh's Kor'kron had imposed strict controls on the Darkspear, rounding up trolls in Orgrimmar and treating them as prisoners in their own capital. The Troll Quarter was effectively a ghetto, guarded by Kor'kron who viewed the Darkspear as enemies rather than allies. Vol'jin's people were being persecuted simply for being what they were. Vol'jin decided he could no longer remain silent. He began reaching out to others who shared his concerns, sending messengers to the other Horde leaders, feeling out who might stand against Garrosh if open rebellion became necessary. The response was overwhelming. The Darkspear were not alone in their suffering. Every non-orc race in the Horde had grievances against Garrosh's rule. The rebellion began with small acts of defiance. Supplies that were supposed to go to the Kor'kron disappeared. Messages passed through networks that Garrosh's spies could not penetrate. Horde soldiers, who still believed in the old values, began to quietly indicate their sympathies. The ground was being prepared for something larger. Bane Bloodhoof had never forgiven Garrosh for his father's death, poisoned blade or not. The Tauren High Chieftain had watched the horde he loved become something cruel and exclusionary. He was ready to fight. Lor'themar Theron, leader of the Blood Elves, had his own grievances. The Sin'dorei had joined the horde out of necessity, seeking allies after the destruction of their homeland by the Scourge. Prince Cael'thas had led them to ruin, but the horde had offered them a chance to rebuild. They had never been fully accepted by Garrosh, who viewed them as too soft, too magical, not truly horde. The Warchief seemed to forget that the Blood Elves had contributed mightily to the horde's victories, that their magisters and rangers had fought and died in service to his wars. The breaking point for Lor'themar came when Garrosh's actions led to catastrophe in Dalaran. The Warchief had ordered Sunreaver agents to use the Kirin Tor's neutral portals to steal a powerful artifact. When the theft was discovered, Jaina Proudmoore, now leader of the Kirin Tor and consumed by her hatred of the Horde after Theramore, ordered the arrest of all Blood Elves in Dalaran. Some resisted and were killed. Others were imprisoned in the Violet Hold. Still others were hunted through the streets of the magical city like animals. The Purge of Dalaran was a betrayal of the neutrality that the Kirin Tor had long maintained, but Garrosh's manipulation had made it inevitable. Lor'themar was furious. He had trusted that the Blood Elves who served as Sunreavers would be protected by their status as members of a neutral organization. Garrosh had used them as pawns, had sacrificed their safety and their lives for his schemes. The Blood Elves who died in Dalaran were murdered because of Garrosh's decisions. Even Sylvanas Windrunner, the Banshee Queen of the Forsaken, whose morality was questionable at best, found common cause with the rebellion. The Dark Lady had her own agenda, her own plans for the future of her undead people. Garrosh's orc-centric vision of the Horde left no room for the Forsaken, whom the Warchief viewed with barely concealed disgust. He tolerated them because they were useful, because their plagues and their soldiers served his wars. But Sylvanas knew that if Garrosh ever felt secure enough, if he ever believed he could rule without the Forsaken's contributions, he would move against her. She needed no excuse to see Garrosh fall. His reign threatened her own power and her plans for the Forsaken. Thrall himself returned from his duties with the Earthen Ring. He had named Garrosh Warchief. The responsibility for what the Horde had become weighed heavily upon him. He could not stand aside while his mistake tore his people apart. Vol'jin reached out to the Alliance as well. This was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the rebellion. After Theramore, after all the blood that had been spilled, Vol'jin asked his enemies for help, and against all expectations, they agreed. King Varian Wrynn had every reason to refuse. His hatred for the Horde had defined much of his life. Garrosh's atrocities had only deepened that hatred. But Varian was also a pragmatist. He understood that a divided assault on Orgrimmar would likely fail. He understood that the Horde rebels were offering him something unprecedented, the chance to remove Garrosh without the full might of the Horde opposing him. Jaina Proudmoore argued against cooperation. Her transformation after Theramore had left her bitter and vengeful. She wanted the Horde destroyed entirely, not just its current warchief. But Varian overruled her. They would work with the rebels, would combine their forces, would bring Garrosh down together. The logistics of the operation were staggering. The Alliance fleet had to sail from Northwatch Hold and rendezvous with Rebel Horde forces without triggering a premature confrontation. Ground forces from Durotar, Mulgore, and the Eastern Kingdoms had to be coordinated. Siege equipment had to be positioned. Intelligence about Orgrimmar's defenses had to be gathered and shared. Vol'jin's rebels struck first, liberating the Echo Isles from Kor'kron occupation and establishing a beachhead in Durotar. They captured Razor Hill, cutting off the northern roads and isolating Orgrimmar from reinforcement. The Kor'kron who fled were not pursued. Vol'jin let them run, knowing that Garrosh would execute them for their failure. Every Kor'kron who died at Garrosh's hands was one fewer soldier defending the city. Chen Stormstout, the famous Pandaren brewmaster, joined the rebellion as well. He had traveled with Vol'jin during the early days of the Mists of Pandaria campaign and had witnessed firsthand the destruction Garrosh had wrought upon his homeland. His presence was a reminder of why this fight mattered, of the innocents who had suffered under Garrosh's ambition. The stage was set. The greatest military operation in recent Azerothian history was about to begin. Alliance and Horde would march together on Orgrimmar, united by a common enemy, uncertain whether the Alliance would survive the battle's end. The Siege of Orgrimmar began not at the gates of the Orcish capital, but in the scarred remains of the Vale of Eternal Blossoms. The Alliance and Horde forces knew that before they could assault Garrosh in his stronghold, they had to deal with the corruption he had unleashed in Pandaria. The Shah contamination could not be allowed to spread further, and the Shah of Pride itself had to be destroyed. The assault on the Vale was led by some of Azeroth's greatest champions. They entered through the shattered summer fields, where the sacred pools had once glittered in the sunlight. Now the waters were black and churning, corrupted beyond recognition. The very air felt wrong, heavy with the weight of dark emotions. The first challenge they faced was Immersis, a massive water elemental that had formed from the corrupted pools themselves. This creature was the embodiment of the Vale's sorrow, the physical manifestation of what Garrosh's actions had done to this sacred place. Before the corruption, these pools had been vessels of life-giving energy, waters that healed wounds and restored vitality. Now they had become something dark and terrible, twisted by the Shah energy that permeated everything Garrosh had touched. Immerseus had no will of its own, no malice in the traditional sense. It was simply corruption given form, an elemental of tainted water that attacked anything that approached the sacred pools it guarded. The creature loomed above the battlefield, like a wave frozen in mid-crash, its form constantly shifting and churning. Where drops of water fell from its body, they sizzled against the stone, eating into the ancient Titan construction with their corrupted essence. The battle against Immerseus was unlike conventional combat in many ways. The elemental could not simply be destroyed through raw damage. Its form was fluid, literally and figuratively, capable of absorbing blows that would have shattered a creature of solid matter. Instead of simply attacking, the champions had to purify it, to separate the corruption from the waters that were its essence and restore them to their natural state. As they struck at Immerseus, it would periodically collapse into hundreds of smaller water globules that scattered across the battlefield. This was the critical phase of the encounter. Some of these globules were deeply corrupted, their waters turned black and smoking with Sha energy. These aggressive droplets attacked anything nearby, seeking to spread their corruption further. Others still held traces of purity beneath their tainted surface, remnants of what the pools had once been. These sought to be cleansed, their waters crying out for restoration. The champions had to manage both types simultaneously, a coordination challenge that required constant awareness and quick reactions. Healers worked to purify the salvageable globules, channeling holy energy or natural restoration magic to cleanse the corruption and restore them to their natural state. Damage dealers focused on destroying the fully corrupted ones before they could reform into Immerseus's main body. Each globule that was purified rather than destroyed weakened the overall corruption of the elemental, slowly tipping the balance from darkness toward light. It was painstaking work, repeating the cycle again and again as Immerseus reformed and split apart multiple times. Each iteration saw fewer corrupted globules and more pure ones as the champion's efforts gradually overwhelmed the Sha energy's hold on the waters. Slowly, painfully, the elemental was cleansed. When Immerseus finally dissipated, its corrupted form giving way at last to the pure essence within, the waters of that portion of the Vale began to clear. The black sludge that had choked the pools dissolved, replaced by crystalline water that sparkled in the dim light. It was a small victory, a single pure pool in an ocean of continuing darkness, but it was proof that the corruption could be fought, that what Garrosh had damaged was not necessarily destroyed forever. The champions pressed deeper into the Vale, toward the ruins of the Golden Pagoda. There they encountered the fallen protectors, 3 spirits who had once been among the Golden Lotus's greatest defenders. These were not ordinary warriors, but paragons of Pandaren virtue, each embodying one of the core principles that had allowed the Pandaren to resist the Sha for 10,000 years. Their fall was more than a tragedy. It was a symbolic defeat of everything the Pandaren had built, everything they had protected, everything they believed in. Rook Stonetoe had been the embodiment of fortitude. He was a massive Pandaren whose physical strength was matched only by his spiritual resilience. For decades, he had stood as a wall between the corruption and the sacred pools, his very presence deterring those who might seek to harm what the Golden Lotus protected. He was the rock upon which their defenses were built, the foundation that gave others the courage to stand against the darkness. When younger protectors faltered, when doubt crept into their hearts, they looked to Rook and found the strength to continue. He never wavered, never complained, never showed weakness, even when the burden seemed impossible to bear. He Softfoot was the master of discipline and focus. Where Rook was strength, he was precision. He could move through shadows without disturbing a single mote of dust. He could strike with such accuracy that his blade found exactly the right point to disable an opponent without killing them. He trained the younger protectors in the arts of awareness, teaching them to see the world as it truly was rather than as they wished it to be. His lessons were harsh but fair, demanding excellence because he knew that anything less would mean failure against the Sha. Those who studied under him emerged transformed, their minds sharpened, their perceptions heightened, their ability to resist the Sha's whispers vastly improved. Sun Tenderheart embodied compassion, the quality that made the Golden Lotus's protection meaningful. Anyone could build walls and station guards. But Sun understood that true protection meant caring for those you defended, understanding their fears and hopes, nurturing their spirits so they could withstand whatever darkness came. She was a healer of both body and soul, capable of mending wounds that went far deeper than flesh. When the Shah energy seeped through the Vale's defenses, when despair began to take root in the hearts of those who lived there, Sun would find them. She would sit with them, listen to them, help them process their negative emotions in healthy ways so that the Shah could not use those emotions as weapons. Together, these three had defended the Vale of Eternal Blossoms for generations. They had faced the Shah countless times, had turned back incursions that should have overwhelmed them, had protected the sacred pools through conflicts that lesser guardians would have fled. They were legends among the Pandaren, their names spoken with reverence, their deeds recorded in the histories that the lore walkers maintained. But Garrosh's desecration had been beyond anything they could have anticipated. When he submerged the heart of Y'Sharj in the sacred pools, the corruption that erupted was overwhelming. The three protectors fought to contain it, sacrificed everything to slow its spread, but they were mortal beings standing against the awakening essence of an old god. They died, but they did not find rest. Now their spirits were trapped, bound by Shah energy to endlessly relive their failure. Lore Walker Cho, who had guided many outsiders through Pandaria's history and wonders, was present to witness this tragedy. He explained that the Shah energy had bound these spirits, forcing them to experience their darkest moments over and over. They were not truly corrupted, not enemies by choice. They were victims, tormented by the echoes of their defeat. The battle against the fallen protectors was a test of awareness and coordination. Each of the three spirits would periodically enter a desperate measures phase, channeling different manifestations of their negative emotions. Rook Stonetoe, overwhelmed by misery, would become vulnerable but summon dark energy that had to be contained. He Softfoot, consumed by anguish, would create manifestations of his sorrow. Sun Tenderheart, racked by despair, would divide into multiple shadow images. The champions could not simply destroy these spirits. They had to defeat all three simultaneously, releasing them from their torment at the same moment so that none would fall back into despair while the others still fought. It required precise damage control, careful management of each spirit's health until finally all three could be freed together. With the fallen protectors released from their suffering, the champions approached the Titan Vault where the heart of Y'Sharj had been kept. The entrance to the underground complex was guarded by Norishan, a Titan construct of immense power. But Norishan was not truly an enemy. He was a watcher, designed to protect the vault and ensure that only the pure of heart could enter. The problem was that no one who had fought across Pandaria, who had experienced the hatred and violence of the faction war, could claim to be entirely pure. The Shah energy that permeated the land had touched everyone. Norishan's sensors detected corruption in even the most noble of heroes. The trial Norishan imposed was one of purification. The Titan Watcher explained that the vault's contents were too dangerous to allow any who carried corruption to approach. The heart of Y'Sharj, fed on negative emotions, grew stronger from them, could use them as weapons against those who thought themselves immune. Any who would challenge what the heart had become must first prove themselves free of the darkness it could exploit. The champions had to face their own inner darkness, to confront manifestations of their pride, their anger, their doubt, and emerge cleansed. The amalgam of corruption, a physical embodiment of their combined negative emotions, had to be destroyed. This creature was a horrid thing, a mass of shadow and malice that pulsed with all the hatred and fear that the champions carried within themselves, whether they acknowledged it or not. One by one, champions would enter a purification realm, a spiritual space where their inner demons took physical form. There, they would battle their personal demons and return cleansed of Shah influence. Each champion's experience was unique, shaped by their own history and their own failings. Warriors faced manifestations of their bloodlust, the joy of killing that they sometimes felt in the heat of battle and then tried to forget afterward. Mages confronted their arrogance, their belief that their mastery of arcane forces made them superior to those who could not wield such power. Priests and paladins faced their doubt, the nagging questions about whether the light truly heard their prayers, or whether their faith was built on nothing more than wishful thinking. It was an exhausting process, both physically and spiritually. Facing one's own darkness is never easy. Many of the champions had done terrible things during the war, had made choices they regretted, had harbored hatreds they knew were wrong. The trial forced them to confront all of it. Some emerged from the purification realm, weeping, overcome by the weight of what they had been forced to acknowledge. Others came back with a strange peace in their eyes, having finally made peace with aspects of themselves they had long denied. The amalgam itself had to be constantly battered while the individual purifications proceeded. Those who had not yet entered the realm, or who had already returned, cleansed, kept the creature occupied while their companions underwent their trials. The amalgam was resilient, capable of regenerating damage quickly, and it grew more powerful as the fight wore on, feeding on whatever scraps of corruption remained in those who faced it. Only through the gradual cleansing of the entire group could the amalgam be weakened enough to destroy. But they endured. They faced their shadows and emerged stronger. Norushan, satisfied that they had proven themselves worthy, allowed them to pass into the heart chamber. The Titan Watcher's voice held something like approval as the barriers fell. They had proven themselves not pure in the sense of being without flaw, but pure in the sense of having acknowledged and confronted their flaws rather than letting them fester in darkness. What they found there confirmed their worst fears. Taranju lay wounded on the floor, barely alive after his confrontation with Garrosh. The great vault was empty, the heart of Yusharj long since taken to Orgrimmar, and in the center of the chamber, freed by Garrosh's actions and feeding on the corruption that saturated the Vale, floated the Shah of Pride. Pride is the most insidious of the negative emotions, the most dangerous of the 7 Shahs, precisely because it is the hardest to recognize as a threat. It does not feel like corruption. It feels like confidence, like deserved recognition, like knowing one's own worth. The Shah of Pride did not attack with obvious malice, the way the other Shah did. It whispered, it insinuated, it offered power and validation to those who would accept it. It told warriors that they were the greatest fighters who had ever lived, told mages that their mastery of the arcane was unparalleled, told leaders that their wisdom and judgment were beyond question. The creature itself was terrible to behold, a manifestation of arrogance given physical form. It towered above the champions, its body shifting and flowing like dark smoke shot through with lightning. Its face, if it could be called a face, wore an expression of absolute contempt, as if the very existence of those who challenged it was an insult to its magnificence. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, the unshakable conviction that it was right and all others were wrong. The battle against the Shah of Pride tested the champions in ways they had not anticipated. The entity constantly attempted to corrupt them, to fill them with unearned confidence, to make them believe they were invincible. Unlike the other Shah, which attacked with claws and dark magic, the Shah of Pride attacked with validation. It praised the champions even as it tried to destroy them, told them how magnificent they were, even as it turned them against each other. A mechanic called pride would build in each champion over time, and if it reached maximum, they would become mind-controlled, turned against their allies. This was the true horror of the Shah of Pride. It did not need to kill its enemies directly. It simply needed to convince them that they no longer needed their friends, that they were strong enough to stand alone, that cooperation was for the weak. Once a champion believed that, they became a weapon against those who had fought beside them. The only way to manage pride was through humility, through acknowledging limitations, through working together rather than trying to be individual heroes. Champions had to interrupt the Shah's attempts to corrupt them, had to use special prisons created by Norishan's remaining power to contain bursts of pride energy before it could be absorbed. They had to resist the temptation to believe they could handle everything alone, had to actively remind themselves that their strength came from unity, not from individual prowess. Lady Jaina Proudmoore and Lord Thamar Theron arrived near the end of the battle, having fought their way through other portions of the Vale. They found Gorehowl, Garrosh's legendary axe, left behind in the chamber. The Warchief had already departed for Orgrimmar with his prize, apparently believing that the heart of Y'Sharj was all he needed, that the weapon of his father was no longer necessary now that he had access to the power of an old god. But the Shah of Pride still had to be defeated. When the Shah finally fell, destroyed by the combined efforts of Alliance and Horde champions working together, the air in the chamber seemed to lighten. The oppressive weight of arrogance that had pressed down on everyone lifted, replaced by something cleaner, more honest. Taranju was evacuated for healing, the Shadow Pan Lord carried by his warriors to safety where priests and monks could tend to his wounds. He had nearly died confronting Garrosh alone, had paid a terrible price for his courage. Jaina and Lorthamar, despite their profound differences and the blood between their peoples, agreed that Garrosh had to be stopped. The mage, who had lost everything at Theramore and the Regent Lord, who had watched his people persecuted under Garrosh's orders, found common ground in their shared determination to end this threat. The temporary alliance would hold, at least until the Warchief was dealt with. After that, the future was uncertain, but for now they had a common enemy, and that was enough. The first phase of the Siege of Orgrimmar was complete. The Vale was still corrupted, would take years to heal, but the immediate Shah threat had been neutralized. Now the real battle could begin. The assault on Orgrimmar proper commenced with a naval approach through Bladefist Bay. The combined Alliance Horde fleet had gathered offshore, an armada of ships from a dozen nations united in common purpose. Human galleons sailed alongside Orcish juggernauts. Night Elf vessels kept formation with troll catamarans. Dwarven ironclads flanked Tauren barges. It was a fleet unlike any that had ever been assembled, brought together, not by conquest or trade, but by the shared need to end a threat that affected them all. Varian Rin commanded from his flagship, the human king standing at the prow as they approached the hostile shore. He was not young anymore, not the impetuous warrior he had been in his youth, but he was still formidable, still the High King of the Alliance, who had earned his title through blood and sacrifice. Vol'jin coordinated the rebel horde forces from a vessel nearby, the troll chieftain's voice carrying across the water as he gave orders in the Darkspear tongue. The sight of Alliance and Horde vessels sailing in formation rather than exchanging cannon fire was unprecedented in living memory. Veterans on both sides who had spent their careers fighting the other faction found themselves uncertain how to feel, their instincts warring with the necessity of the moment. Garrosh had anticipated a naval assault. The Dragonmaw clan under Warlord Zayla had fortified the entire shoreline with the efficiency of orcs who knew their lives depended on holding this position. Anti-air batteries lined the cliffs, their goblin-designed cannons capable of tracking and destroying aerial targets at considerable range. Infantry positions overlooked every beach, rows of Kor'kron soldiers armed with crossbows and siege weapons, ready to turn any landing into a slaughter. Barricades blocked every path from the shore into the city proper. Trenches had been dug, obstacles placed, killing grounds carefully prepared. And circling above it all, riding her massive proto-drake Galakris, Zayla herself directed the defense. The warlord of the Dragonmaw had earned her position through prowess in battle, had united her fractured clan, and led them to Garrosh's banner. She was utterly loyal to the Warchief, who had helped her rise to power, and she would not let him down. From Galakris's back, she could see the entire battlefield, could issue orders to her subordinates, could swoop down personally to break any concentration of enemy forces that threatened to punch through her lines. The landing at Drenoshar Landing was brutal beyond anything the assault force had expected. The defenders had the advantage of position, raining arrows and artillery down on the assault craft as they approached the shore. Many soldiers died before they even reached the beach, their transports destroyed by the relentless bombardment, their bodies washing up on sands that would soon be stained red with blood. But the combined forces pressed forward, establishing a beachhead through sheer determination and overwhelming numbers. For every soldier who fell, 2 more took their place. The fleet was enormous, its resources seemingly inexhaustible, and Zayla's defenders, though well-positioned, were finite. The key to breaking the Dragonmaw defense was Galakris. As long as Zayla controlled the sky, her forces could not be dislodged. The Proto-Drake's attacks devastated entire formations, fire and claw and tail scattering soldiers who had been forming up for a push inland. And Zayla's tactical direction kept the defenders coordinated and effective, shifting reserves to threatened sectors, calling in artillery strikes on enemy concentrations, always seeming to know where the next threat would come from. The champions leading the assault realized they needed to bring Galakris down. Along the bay stood 2 guard towers, each equipped with anti-air cannons that had been designed to repel flying attackers. If those towers could be captured and their guns turned against Galakris, the Proto-Drake could be grounded. It was a risky plan, requiring forces to split and attack 2 objectives simultaneously, while the main body held the beach. But it was the only plan that offered any hope of success. The assault on the towers was a coordinated operation that tested the combined forces' ability to work together. While the main force held the beach and engaged the Dragonmaw infantry, strike teams fought their way into each tower. The defenders were numerous and determined. Dragonmaw Ebonstalkers attacked from the shadows, assassins who targeted leaders, and spellcasters with deadly precision. Tidal shamans called upon corrupted water magic, summoning waves that battered the attackers and whirlpools that tried to drag them out to sea. Flameslingers hurled incendiary projectiles that set flesh and armor ablaze. And all the while, Galakris swept overhead, breathing destruction on exposed positions, forcing the attackers to scatter or die. One tower fell, then the other. The captured anti-air guns swiveled, tracking Galakris as she wheeled through the sky. The guns fired, shells exploding against the Proto-Drake's armored hide. Galakris screamed in pain and anger, but she was too proud, too committed to retreat. She had served Zayla faithfully for years. She would not abandon her rider now, would not flee from these invaders who dared to challenge her dominion of the sky. She descended to deal with the threat personally. On the ground, Galakris was still fearsome, but she was no longer invincible. The champions engaged her directly while the anti-air guns continued to fire, preventing her from taking flight again. The Proto-Drake thrashed and roared, her claws tearing gouges in the stone, her tail sweeping soldiers aside like toys. But she was grounded now, unable to use the mobility that had made her so deadly, forced to fight on terms that favored her enemies. Zayla dismounted to fight alongside her mount, her axe flashing in the smoke-filled air, her battle cries rallying those Dragonmaw who still lived. But even her skill was not enough against the concentrated force arrayed against her. She was one warrior, however skilled, facing an army. When Galakris finally fell, mortally wounded, Zayla was thrown from her saddle. The warlord vanished in the chaos, her fate uncertain. Some said she died on the beach. Others claimed they saw her retreat into the city, wounded but alive. The truth would not be known for some time. What mattered in that moment was that the Dragonmaw defense collapsed without her leadership. Without Galakris, without Zayla's tactical direction, the defenders were just soldiers holding positions they could no longer hold. The beach was secured. The next obstacle was the Iron Juggernaut. This massive war machine blocked the main approach to Orgrimmar's gates, a mechanical scorpion of gleaming metal and deadly weaponry that stood as tall as a small building. Siegecrafter Blackfuse had designed it to be nearly indestructible, capable of withstanding anything the enemy could throw at it. It was his masterwork, the culmination of years of engineering innovation combined with technology salvaged from Titan facilities across Pandaria. The Iron Juggernaut was unlike anything the champions had faced before. It was not a living creature that could be reasoned with, intimidated, or made to feel pain in any meaningful way. It was a machine driven by sophisticated goblin engineering and powered by engines that burned with fell-touched fire. Its shell was crafted from reinforced serenite, the same metal that had formed the gates of Icecrown Citadel, and every joint was protected by overlapping plates that made finding a weak point nearly impossible. The Iron Juggernaut attacked with devastating efficiency. Its tail cannon fired explosive shells that created craters in the earth, shells that scattered shrapnel in every direction and could kill unarmored soldiers dozens of yards from the point of impact. Its claws could crush stone and steel alike, could pick up an armored knight and squeeze until the metal crumpled and the person inside simply ceased to exist. Mines scattered across the battlefield detonated at approach, proximity-triggered devices that the machine deployed constantly throughout the fight, turning the entire area into a deadly maze that had to be navigated, while simultaneously dealing with the construct's other attacks. Saw blades launched from hidden compartments shredded anyone who got too close. These spinning discs of razor-sharp metal were guided by targeting systems that tracked heat signatures and movement, adjusting their trajectory mid-flight to follow dodging targets. Even experienced warriors found themselves unable to evade the blade's pursuit, forced to deflect them with shields or weapons, or simply take the hit and hope their armor held. The construct also periodically entered a siege mode, planting its legs and becoming immobile but channeling all of its power into a devastating bombardment. During these phases, fiery projectiles would rain down across the entire battlefield, turning the ground into a hellscape of burning craters and choking smoke. There was no cover that could protect against this assault, no tactic that could negate it completely. The champions simply had to endure, healing through the damage as best they could while praying for the barrage to end. But the war machine had weaknesses, flaws in its design that became apparent only through careful observation during combat. Its joints were vulnerable when it reared for certain attacks, the overlapping plates separating just enough to allow a precisely aimed strike to damage the mechanisms beneath. Its ammunition had to be reloaded, creating windows of opportunity when its most dangerous attacks were temporarily unavailable. Its cooling systems could be overloaded by sustained assault, forcing it to vent steam that obscured its targeting sensors. The champions exploited every weakness, hammering at the construct until finally its engines failed and its weapons fell silent. The Iron Juggernaut's death was not dramatic. It did not explode or collapse. It simply stopped moving, its systems shutting down one by one as damage accumulated beyond what even goblin engineering could compensate for. The last thing to fail was its main engine, a deep rumbling that faded into silence as the great machine became nothing more than an enormous piece of scrap metal blocking the road. General Nazgrim stood in the wreckage of the Iron Juggernaut, watching the approach of the combined forces. He was one of the Horde's greatest warriors, a soldier who had risen from grunt to general through decades of loyal service. He had fought alongside many of the champions now arrayed against him during campaigns in Grizzly Hills and Vashjir. He respected them. In another time, another circumstance, he would have been proud to call them comrades. But Nazgrim was bound by duty. He had sworn an oath to serve the warchief, whoever that warchief might be. His personal feelings about Garrosh did not matter. The code of the warrior demanded loyalty above all. He would not abandon his post, would not betray his oath, even if it meant fighting against former allies. The battle at the gates of Orgrimmar was personal in a way the previous encounters had not been. Many of the champions arrayed against Nazgrim had fought beside him in the past. They had shared campfires in Grizzly Hills during the Northrend campaign, had struggled together to escape the Naga in the depths of Vashjir, had coordinated assaults against the Shah throughout Pandaria. Nazgrim had risen from a simple grunt to one of the most respected generals in the Horde's military, and his ascent had been witnessed by adventurers who now stood against him. The general understood this tragic irony. As the battle began, he addressed the champions directly. He told them that he held no personal animosity toward them, that he respected their strength and their dedication to their causes. But he was an orc who had been freed from the Alliance internment camps, who owed everything he had to the Horde. He had sworn an oath to serve the Warchief, and that oath did not contain clauses for convenience or personal preference. He would stand his post until he died, because that was what honor demanded. Nazgrim fought with everything he had, using every skill he had learned in his long military career. He called reinforcements from the Kor'kron reserves, fresh soldiers who charged into the fray with weapons raised and battle cries on their lips. He entered defensive stances that made him nearly invulnerable to physical attacks, forcing the champions to wait for openings or risk exhausting themselves against his guard. Then he would shift to berserker rages that multiplied his damage output, becoming a whirlwind of steel that could cut down multiple enemies with a single devastating sweep of his axe. The general also understood tactics. He knew that the champions were powerful, that they had defeated countless enemies throughout their careers. A straightforward battle of attrition would not favor him against such overwhelming force, so he varied his approach, keeping the champions off balance, forcing them to adapt to constantly changing situations. His Kor'kron would target healers first, trying to remove the support that kept the assault group alive. Warsong banners would be planted throughout the battlefield, inspiring the defenders to greater feats of valor and strengthening their resolve. But the champions were many, and Nazgrim was ultimately one orc, however skilled. They wore him down through attrition, through coordinated assault, through refusing to give him the one-on-one duel that would have given him his best chance at victory. Each time he nearly broke their lines, they rallied around their strongest warriors. Each time he killed one of their number, healers brought the fallen back to their feet. The Kor'kron defenders around him began to fall, and no reinforcements came to replace them. The gates had been breached. When Nazgrim finally fell, there was no triumph in the victory, only a somber recognition that a great warrior had died as he lived, in service to his duty. His last words were, "I die with honor, Loktair Ogar," the battle cry of the Horde, uttered with his final breath. Some of the champions who had known him in better times paused to salute their fallen adversary. He had been wrong to serve Garrosh, perhaps, but he had served with a purity of purpose that demanded respect even from his enemies. Nazgrim's body was later collected and given a proper burial in the graveyard of Durotar, not far from the gates he had died defending. The gates of Orgrimmar lay open. The true battle was about to begin. Beyond those gates lay the Underhold, the subterranean complex where Garrosh had gathered his power and his most dangerous servants. Within Orgrimmar, the streets that had once bustled with traders and craftsmen were empty. The civilian population had been evacuated or had fled. What remained was a fortress city, every street a kill zone, every building a potential stronghold. The Kor'kron had prepared for this assault, and they intended to make the Ichi attackers pay for every inch of ground. The dark shamans waited in Grommash Hold. Earthbreaker Harem and Wavebinder Cardris had once been respected teachers, shamans who had trained others in the proper way to commune with the elements. Their names had been spoken with honor in the circles of those who followed the shamanic path. Young orcs who showed aptitude for communing with the spirits would be sent to learn from them, and they would return transformed. Their connection to the natural world deepened and strengthened. But they had turned to dark shamanism under Garrosh's influence, forcing the elements into servitude rather than asking for their cooperation. The Warchief had promised them power beyond anything they had ever known, had convinced them that the traditional methods were weak, that the elements needed to be dominated rather than partnered with. Whether through genuine belief in Garrosh's vision or through fear of what would happen if they refused, Haram and Cardris had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Dark shamanism was an abomination to any who understood the true nature of elemental magic. The elements were not slaves to be commanded. They were partners, spirits of incredible power who chose to aid mortal shamans in exchange for respect and reverence. A traditional shaman approached the elements with humility, asking for their assistance rather than demanding it, offering something of themselves in return for the power they were granted. The relationship was built on mutual benefit, on trust that had developed over centuries of interaction between mortals and the primal forces of nature. To force the elements was to corrupt the very foundation of this ancient practice. It was a violation of the natural order, a perversion of everything that shamanism was supposed to represent. The elements that were enslaved did not serve willingly. They screamed in torment, their essence twisted and corrupted by the chains of dark magic that bound them. Every spell cast through dark shamanism was an act of torture. Every manifestation of elemental power, a cry of pain from beings that had never asked to be weapons. Haram and Cardris had embraced this corruption fully. They commanded tortured elementals that had been bound against their will, twisted versions of fire, water, earth, and air that obeyed not out of partnership, but out of enslavement. Their power was immense, but it was stolen power, power that came at a terrible cost to the natural order. Thrall, had he been present to witness what they had become, would have wept at the betrayal of everything he had worked to restore after the orcs broke free of their demonic corruption. The battle against the dark shamans was chaotic beyond anything the champions had experienced in the previous encounters. The two shamans worked in concert, combining their abilities in ways that were difficult to predict. Poison-corrupted water would merge with burning ash, creating clouds of scalding toxic steam that ate through armor and burned lungs. Toxic clouds would be driven by unnatural winds, chasing fleeing champions across the battlefield like predators hunting prey. The very ground would heave and crack, creating hazardous terrain across the entire battlefield that shifted and changed as the fight progressed. Haram called upon the earth and fire, slamming the ground to create fissures from which enslaved earth elementals emerged. These constructs of tortured stone pursued the champions relentlessly, exploding when they drew close enough to inflict maximum damage. He would also summon ashen walls, barriers of burning ash that divided the battlefield and dealt devastating damage to anyone who tried to pass through them. Cardris commanded water and air, summoning toxic tornadoes that wandered the battlefield, leaving trails of poison in their wake. She would call down falling ash that blanketed entire sections of the arena, forcing the champions to constantly relocate to avoid being buried in burning debris. Her toxic mist would periodically envelop large areas, dealing damage over time to anyone caught within and obscuring vision so that the champions could not easily coordinate their movements. The champions had to constantly adapt, moving to avoid environmental hazards while maintaining their assault on both targets. The two shamans had to be kept relatively close together, as they would heal each other if separated. It was a fight that demanded mobility, awareness, and coordination, a constant dance of avoidance and aggression that left no room for error. When the dark shamans finally fell, the elements they had enslaved dissipated, finally freed from their torment. For a moment, the air in Grommish Hold seemed to shimmer, as if spirits were passing through on their way to somewhere else. Perhaps the tortured elementals were returning to the primal planes from which they had been torn. Perhaps they were simply ceasing to exist, their essences too damaged by their enslavement to continue. Either way, the oppressive weight of their suffering lifted, and the natural order began to reassert itself. But there was no time to celebrate. The path to Garrosh's compound lay ahead. The entrance to the Underhold was beneath Ragefire Chasm, the volcanic caves that lay under Orgrimmar. This had always been a dangerous place, home to fire elementals and worse. Garrosh had transformed it into his ultimate stronghold, expanding the caves into a complex of chambers where his experiments and his power base resided. Malkorok waited in the first major chamber, standing guard over his master's sanctum. Garrosh's most loyal enforcer was a Blackrock orc who had once served under Rend Blackhand in the Dark Horde, the remnant of the original orcish invasion that had festered in Blackrock Mountain for years. When the Dark Horde had fallen, Malkorok had renounced his former masters and pledged himself to Garrosh, seeing in the new Warchief a leader worthy of his absolute devotion. That devotion had been rewarded with power beyond anything Malkorok could have achieved on his own. Garrosh had transformed him by the power of Y'Sharj, infusing his body with old god energy that made him faster, stronger, and more resilient than any normal orc. The corruption was visible in his appearance, dark veins pulsing beneath his skin like rivers of shadow, his eyes glowing with unnatural light that spoke of the dark power coursing through him. He had become something more than orc, something less than human in his moral considerations. Malkorok had served as Garrosh's chief enforcer throughout the Pandaria campaign, rooting out dissent within Orgrimmar, punishing those who questioned the Warchief's decisions, ensuring that all opposition was silenced. He believed completely in Garrosh's vision of orcish supremacy. He had no sympathy for the other races of the Horde, viewed them as tools at best and obstacles at worst. When Garrosh had needed a volunteer to be infused with Y'Sharj's power directly, Malkorok had stepped forward without hesitation. The chamber where Malkorok stood was filled with a miasma, a dark fog that changed the rules of combat entirely. This was the breath of Yasharj, a manifestation of the old god's essence that saturated the air and twisted the very nature of reality. Within this miasma, healing magic did not function normally. Instead of restoring health, healing spells created absorbed shields on their targets. Life could not be restored, only protected from further damage. Malkorok's attacks were devastating. He wielded massive hammers that could crush armor and bone alike, weapons that had been enhanced by the same dark power that flowed through his veins. He would periodically slam the ground, creating expanding pools of corruption that damaged anyone standing in them. These pools would grow and merge, eventually covering much of the battlefield and forcing the champions to constantly relocate. He would mark targets with debuffs that would explode after a short time, forcing affected champions to move away from their allies or risk killing them all in a chain reaction of dark energy. The explosions were powerful enough to one-shot anyone caught in the blast, turning marked champions into walking time bombs that had to be isolated from the group. The key to surviving the encounter was managing the absorb shields. Champions who did not have shields when Malkorok unleashed his most powerful attacks would take lethal damage. Healers had to ensure that everyone was constantly topped off, that the shields never fully depleted. It was an endurance fight as much as a damage race, a test of coordination and awareness that punished any lapse in attention. When Malkorok died, his body did not simply fall. The corruption within him erupted outward, and for a moment his form seemed to expand, to become something truly monstrous. The outline of his body blurred and shifted, revealing the old god energy that had replaced so much of what he once was. Then it collapsed, the dark power dissipating into nothing, returning to whatever void it had come from. Garrosh's most trusted enforcer was no more, his absolute loyalty having led him to absolute destruction. Deeper in the Underhold, the champions encountered a vault containing the spoils of Garrosh's Pandarian campaign. This was no ordinary treasure room. It was a museum of conquest, a gallery of stolen power. Artifacts from the Mogu, the Mantid, and the Pandaren themselves had been gathered here over months of looting and pillaging, weapons and treasures that Garrosh intended to use in his conquest of Azeroth. Some of these items radiated power that could be felt from across the room. Others seemed inert, but hummed with potential that suggested they were merely dormant, waiting for the right circumstances to awaken. A Titan security system protected the vault, its protocols corrupted and repurposed by the Blackfuse Company. The goblins had hacked into ancient Titan technology, had bent it to serve Garrosh's purposes, but they had not fully understood what they were dealing with. The security system was designed to protect these artifacts from falling into the wrong hands, and it did not distinguish between those who had stolen the items and those who had come to stop the thieves. The Spoils of Pandaria encounter was a race against time that tested the champions' ability to split their focus and work independently. The security system would activate a decontamination sequence, if not deactivated, flooding the vault with lethal energy that would kill everything organic within its walls. The only way to prevent this was to destroy enough of the stored artifacts to reduce the vault's power level below the activation threshold. The champions split into two groups, each tackling one side of the vault. The symmetry of the challenge was deliberate, each side containing similar threats that had to be dealt with in similar ways. They smashed through Mogu constructs, animated statues that defended the treasures they had been placed among. They slew mantid warriors that had been preserved in stasis, ancient soldiers awakened by the intrusion and confused about where they were and why these strange beings were attacking them. They destroyed powerful artifacts that radiated dangerous energy, weapons, and devices whose purposes they could only guess at, but whose threat was undeniable. All the while, the timer counted down, the security system warning them in a calm, measured voice that decontamination was imminent. The voice grew more insistent as the countdown progressed, updating them on how much time remained, how much power still needed to be neutralized, whether they were on pace to succeed or whether they would all die in the cleansing fire of Titan technology. Both groups completed their tasks with seconds to spare. The security system recognized that the vault's contents had been neutralized and stood down, welcoming them in the recorded voice of Siegecrafter Blackfuse. The goblin's personality was present, even in his automated systems, smug and self-congratulatory, congratulating them on their efficiency and inviting them to proceed further into the complex. It was a strange experience, being welcomed by the voice of someone they would soon have to kill. Thaddeus, a construct that Blackfuse had assembled from the body parts of various creatures, animated by electrical energy in a manner reminiscent of the abominations of Naxxramas, waited in a subsequent chamber. This patchwork horror was a testament to Blackfuse's disturbing creativity, his willingness to experiment with life and death in pursuit of more powerful weapons. The construct had to be destroyed before the champions could proceed. Then came Siegecrafter Blackfuse himself, the goblin engineer whose weapons and machines had armed Garrosh's true horde. He was small, as all goblins were, but his presence was enormous. His workshop was a death trap, filled with conveyor belts carrying weapons in various stages of assembly, automated turrets that tracked movement and fired without warning, mines scattered across the floor that would explode at the slightest pressure, and other hazards that defied easy categorization. Blackfuse himself wrote a machine that could adapt to any threat, deploying different weapons depending on what was needed, always staying one step ahead of the champion's attempts to pin him down. The key to defeating Blackfuse was controlling the environment. Champions had to destroy certain weapons on the conveyor belts before they could be assembled and deployed, had to prioritize which threats to neutralize, first based on what was coming down the line. They had to avoid the automated defenses while maintaining pressure on Blackfuse himself. It was a fight of awareness and priority management, with dozens of things demanding attention at once, a cognitive overload that would have broken lesser groups. Blackfuse died as he lived, tinkering and adjusting until the very end. Even as his health dropped to critical levels, he was calling out adjustments to systems that would never be completed, giving orders to machines that would soon fall silent. His last words were complaints about calibration errors, unable to accept that his creations had been overcome. The workshop fell silent as its master expired, the machines winding down one by one, the conveyor belts grinding to a halt, the automated defenses powering off. Siegecrafter Blackfuse's legacy of destruction ended not with a bang, but with the quiet cessation of mechanical function. The penultimate defenders of Garrosh's inner sanctum were the paragons of the Klaxi. These ancient Mantid champions had been awakened from their amber prisons throughout the Pandaria campaign, and many adventurers had worked alongside them against the corrupted Empress Shek'Zir. The Klaxi had seemed like allies, or at least enemies of a common foe. They had provided assistance, shared knowledge, even offered rewards for services rendered. Many champions had trusted them. But the Klaxi had always served Y'Sharj. This had been hinted at during interactions with them, in the way they spoke reverently of the Old One, in the murals that decorated their hidden chambers, in the ancient prophecies they referenced. Kilruk the Windreaver had even warned the adventurers explicitly after the defeat of Empress Shek'Zir. He had told them that the Mantid served a power far greater than mortal comprehension, that if the Old One should ever return, the Mantid would side with their ancient master against all others. When Garrosh awakened the heart of Y'Sharj, the Klaxi revealed their true allegiance. They were not allies of convenience. They were servants of the old god, bound by oaths older than recorded history. The moment the heart began to pulse with renewed power, the paragons heard its call and answered. They journeyed to Orgrimmar to serve Garrosh, whom they viewed not as a leader, but as a herald of Y'Sharj's return. The orc was merely a tool, a means by which their true god might reclaim dominion over the world. 9 paragons stood in defense of Garrosh's throne room, the Chamber of the Paragons. Each was a legend among the Mantid, heroes preserved in amber for centuries or millennia, awakened in times of great need to serve the swarm. Their names were spoken with reverence in Mantid society, their deeds recorded in songs and histories that stretched back to the age of the old gods themselves. Kilruk the Windreaver was their leader in this confrontation, the same paragon who had warned the champions of what was to come. He could fly through the air faster than the eye could follow, his razor-sharp wings slicing through armor as easily as flesh. His aerial assaults were nearly impossible to evade, and his mobility made him one of the most dangerous opponents the champions had ever faced. Zarl the Poisoned Mind was a master toxicologist whose venoms could kill in 100 different ways. He wielded toxins that corroded flesh, that paralyzed muscles, that caused organs to fail one by one. Some of his poisons worked quickly, killing in seconds. Others worked slowly, giving victims time to realize what was happening, but not enough time to do anything about it. Kaztik the Manipulator commanded Kunchongs and other creatures with absolute authority, bending their wills to his own through ancient techniques of pheromone control. The beasts he summoned during the battle would grow and strengthen if not dealt with quickly, eventually becoming threats that could overwhelm the entire assault force. Corvin the Prime was the eldest and most venerable of the paragons, a living repository of Mantid knowledge and tradition. His strength was not in flashy abilities, but in his resilience and his mastery of amber preservation techniques that could encase enemies in crystallized sap. Ayokuk the Lucid possessed mental powers that could discern any weakness, could read the patterns of combat, and predict what enemies would do before they did it. He calculated trajectories and timings with mathematical precision, turning the battle into an equation that he always seemed to solve first. Karaz, the locust's leaping strikes, could carry him across an entire battlefield in a single bound. He would crash down upon groups of champions, scattering them and disrupting their formations with the sheer force of his impacts. Skier the Bloodseeker was driven by an insatiable hunger for combat, a berserker whose fury only increased as the battle wore on. The more blood was spilled, the stronger he became, feeding on the violence like a vampire feeding on life force. Rikakal the Dissector studied his enemies by taking them apart, analyzing their physiology with clinical precision. He could identify vulnerabilities that others would never notice, striking at exactly the right points to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. And Hisek, the Swarm Keeper, never missed his mark. His arrows could track targets around corners, could adjust their flight mid-air to compensate for evasive maneuvers. There was no hiding from his volleys, no dodging his precision strikes. The battle against the Paragons was one of the most complex encounters the champions had ever faced. Only 3 Paragons would fight at any given time, but when one fell, another would awaken to take its place. Each Paragon had unique abilities that had to be countered in specific ways. The combination of active Paragons changed constantly, creating an ever-shifting tactical puzzle that demanded constant adaptation. The champions had to learn the patterns and abilities of all 9 Paragons, adapting their strategy as the active combination shifted. Kilrook's Reeve ability could decimate clustered groups, forcing the champions to spread out. Zaro's poisons required precise movement to avoid lethal accumulation, demanding constant awareness of ground conditions. Kastik's Kunchongs had to be destroyed before they grew to unmanageable size, requiring dedicated attention from part of the assault force. Every Paragon who fell triggered a new combination. Strategies that worked against one trio might fail catastrophically against another. The champions had to remain flexible, had to communicate constantly, had to be willing to abandon approaches that stopped working and embrace new tactics on the fly. The fight was long and grueling. Every time a Paragon fell, the champions thought it might be over, only for another to rise and join the battle. The chamber of the Paragons echoed with the sounds of combat, with the buzzing of manted wings and the clash of weapons against chitin. Casualties mounted on both sides, and there were moments when the outcome seemed uncertain. But finally, the last of the 9 died, their ancient bodies crumbling to dust. The Paragons had fallen defending their god, had served Isharge until the very end. It was, perhaps, the death they would have chosen, dying in battle against worthy opponents in service to a cause they believed in absolutely. Only Garrosh remained. The final chamber was not what anyone expected. Instead of a throne room of Orcish design, they found themselves in a space that seemed to exist between realities. The heart of Isharge floated at the center, pulsing with malevolent energy. Shah corruption saturated the air, thick enough to taste. Garrosh Hellscream stood before the heart, transformed by its power. His skin was marked with dark veins, his eyes glowed with old god energy, and in his hands he held not Gorehowl, but a new weapon, Zal Atto, the desecrated image of Gorehowl, a version of his father's axe that had been corrupted and enhanced by Isharge's power. Thrall was there as well, but he was incapacitated, held immobile by the corruption that permeated the chamber. He could only watch as the champions faced his former protege. The battle against Garrosh was epic in every sense of the word. He was no longer merely a powerful warrior, no longer the proud but ultimately mortal orc who had risen to lead the horde through sheer strength and force of will. He was an avatar of old god power, wielding abilities that defied natural law, his body infused with the essence of a being that had threatened all of existence in the age before the mortal races arose. The fight would span multiple phases, multiple realms, and would test everything the champions had learned throughout their entire careers as adventurers. The chamber itself seemed to pulse with dark energy, the walls flickering between the familiar stone of Orgrimmar and something else, something that hinted at the nightmare realm that lay just beyond the veil of reality. The heart of Y'Sharj floated above the throne, its corrupted glow illuminating everything with a sickly purple light that made shadows dance in ways they should not. The air was thick with the taste of corruption, a metallic tang that coated the tongue and made breathing difficult. Garrosh stood at the center of this corruption, and he was magnificent in a terrible way. Zal Atto, the desecrated image of Gorehowl, hummed with power in his hands, the weapon that had been his father's legacy, now twisted into something that Grommash would not have recognized. Dark veins pulsed across Garrosh's skin, visible even through his armor, and his eyes glowed with the same purple light that emanated from the heart. He looked upon the champions who had fought their way through his defenses, and he smiled. In the first phase, Garrosh fought with the true horde at his back. Kor'kron warriors and siege machines supported him as he unleashed devastating attacks that shook the very foundations of the chamber. He would hurl his desecrated weapon at targets, the axe spinning through the air with impossible accuracy and leaving zones of corruption where it landed. Anyone who stepped into these zones found themselves racked with pain as old god energy ate at their life force from within. He would call down iron stars, massive rolling weapons that had to be avoided or destroyed before they reached their targets, the same devastating constructs that had crushed entire battalions during the Iron Horde's invasion of Azeroth. His Hellscream war song echoed through the chamber, inspiring his allies, making them faster and stronger, filling them with the same fanatical devotion that had carried them this far. The Kor'kron who answered his call were not afraid to die. They were the true horde, believers in Garrosh's vision of orcish supremacy, and they would give their lives gladly if it meant their warchief could triumph. The champions fought through the reinforcements, whittling down Garrosh's health while managing the chaos of the battlefield. Engineers had to be stopped before they could activate more iron stars, the goblin technicians scurrying through the chaos to reach the launch mechanisms. The desecrated weapons had to be destroyed before their corruption zones grew too large, requiring constant attention even as Garrosh himself pressed his assault. It was organized chaos, with threats coming from every direction, demanding the kind of coordination and awareness that could only come from teams that had fought together through countless previous challenges. When Garrosh's health dropped below a certain threshold, he drew upon the heart of Y'Sharj directly. The power flooded into him, healing his wounds and granting him new abilities. More importantly, he used that power to transport the champions into the realm of Y'Sharj, a nightmare dimension where the old god's influence was absolute. The realm of Yasharj was a twisted version of Pandaria, showing what the continent might have become if Yasharj had never been slain. This was not an illusion or a simple magical construct. This was a glimpse into an alternate reality, a timeline where the Titans had never intervened, where Yasharj's corruption had been allowed to spread until it consumed everything. The champions found themselves standing in temples of corruption where the walls wept with dark ichor. They walked through fields where the grass had withered and died 10,000 years ago, replaced by fungal growths that pulsed with sickly light. Above them, skies of roiling purple clouds churned with energy that hurt to look upon directly. The champions found themselves in different locations each time they were transported, the realm reshaping itself to torment them with corrupted versions of places they might have known. Sometimes they appeared in the terrace of Endless Spring, where the waters that should have been pure and clear now bubbled with toxic corruption. Sometimes they found themselves in the Temple of the Jade Serpent, its peaceful grounds transformed into a nightmare of shadow and decay. Sometimes they materialized in the Temple of the Red Crane, the place that should have embodied hope, now radiating nothing but despair. Each location spawned different types of Shah minions that had to be destroyed, manifestations of the darkness that would have consumed all of Pandaria if Yasharj had been allowed to reign supreme, while in the realm, Garrosh was shielded and channeling. He stood at the center of the nightmare, drawing power from the very fabric of this corrupted reality, absorbing energy from the heart of Yasharj that grew stronger with each passing moment. The champions could see him, even as they fought the Shah minions, could see the dark energy flowing into him, could watch his power growing. They had to defeat all the Shah minions quickly, breaking the shield so they could interrupt Garrosh's channel. Any energy he successfully absorbed would empower his abilities when they returned to the normal realm, would make his attacks stronger, would bring them that much closer to defeat. The transition back was marked by Garrosh's Annihilate, a massive attack that dealt damage to everyone based on how much energy he had absorbed. This was not a simple spell or strike. It was a wave of pure old god power that washed over everything in the chamber, a manifestation of Yasharj's ancient hatred for all living things. If the champions had been slow in the realm, if they had let Garrosh channel too long, the Annihilate could be lethal, could wipe entire groups from existence in a single terrible moment. The pattern repeated multiple times, each cycle more grueling than the last. Fight Garrosh in the throne room, get transported to the realm, destroy the Shah, return and survive the Annihilate. The champions grew exhausted, their resources depleting with each transition, their bodies aching from wounds that accumulated faster than the healers could address. Each cycle, Garrosh grew more desperate, more willing to draw upon the heart's power, regardless of the cost to his own humanity. And each cycle, he grew stronger while they grew weaker. In the final phase, when Garrosh's health dropped critically low, he made one last choice. It was the choice of a desperate man who had lost everything, who saw his dreams of glory slipping away, who refused to accept defeat even when defeat was inevitable. He absorbed the entirety of the heart's remaining power, transforming completely. His body grew massive, swelling with dark energy, until he was barely recognizable as the orc who had once led the Horde, His corruption became total. He became Shah Garrosh, the true Warchief, an avatar of Yasharja's will given physical form. The transformation was terrible to witness. Garrosh's skin split and reformed, dark tendrils erupting from his body like the tentacles of some deep-sea nightmare. His eyes, once burning with orcish fire, now glowed with the same purple light as the heart itself. His voice, when he spoke, was layered with whispers that seemed to come from countless directions at once, the voice of Yasharj speaking through a mortal vessel. He looked upon the champions with something that was no longer merely hatred. It was the contempt of an ancient god for the insects that dared to challenge its chosen servant. In this form, Garrosh was more powerful than ever before. His attacks left lasting corruption on the ground, pools of darkness that spread and merged until the entire floor seemed to writhe with malevolent life. He could spawn minions of Yasharj that would empower each other if killed in close proximity, requiring the champions to carefully manage when and where they dealt killing blows. He would periodically channel devastating attacks that required specific positioning to survive, forcing everyone to move in perfect coordination or die in waves of dark energy. The entire room became a hazardous environment, with safe ground constantly shrinking, the corruption spreading like a living tide that sought to consume everything it touched. But the champions had come too far to fail now. They had fought through the Vale of Eternal Blossoms, had purified the corruption that Garrosh had unleashed upon that sacred land. They had stormed the beaches of Bladefist Bay under withering fire from the Dragonmaw defenders. They had broken the gates of Orgrimmar despite the Iron Juggernaut and General Nazgrim's valiant defense. They had descended into the Underhold and defeated Garrosh's lieutenants one by one, each victory bringing them closer to this final confrontation. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, lost too many friends along the way. They would not be stopped now, not when they were so close to ending this. The final minutes of the fight were the most desperate any of them had ever experienced. Champions fell and were revived, only to fall again moments later. Healers pushed their mana to the limit, then pushed past it, drawing on reserves they did not know they had. Damage dealers squeezed every last bit of output from their abilities, ignoring their own safety to focus entirely on bringing Garrosh down. Tanks traded off as their cooldowns expired, each buying precious seconds for the others to recover, each knowing that a moment's hesitation could mean the death of everyone. The corruption was everywhere now. There was almost no safe ground left. The champions were taking constant damage just from standing in the chamber, their healers frantically trying to keep everyone alive while also managing the corruption debuffs that threatened to overwhelm them. Garrosh's attacks came faster and faster, his desperation matching their own, both sides knowing that this was the end, that one of them would not walk away from this chamber. And then, at last, Garrosh fell. The Shah energy that had infused him dissipated. His body returned to normal, beaten and broken but alive. The heart of Yasharj, drained of the power Garrosh had absorbed, began to fail. Its pulse weakened, its glow faded. After 10,000 years, the last remnant of the old god was finally dying. Garrosh lay on the ground, defeated but unrepentant. He looked up at his enemies, at the Alliance and Horde who had united against him, and there was no surrender in his eyes. The aftermath of the battle was tense. Thrall, freed from his paralysis when the heart's power failed, approached Garrosh with murder in his eyes. He had made Garrosh Warchief. He had believed in him, had seen potential where others saw only danger. Every crime Garrosh had committed, every atrocity, every drop of blood spilled, weighed on Thrall's conscience. He raised his weapon to strike the killing blow. King Varian Wrynn stopped him. The human king, who had every reason to want Garrosh dead, who had lost countless subjects to Garrosh's campaigns, stepped forward and stayed Thrall's hand. Varian had changed over the years. He had been consumed by hatred for the Horde once, had let his rage define him. But he had learned, through hard experience, that there had to be something beyond vengeance. Justice was not the same as revenge. A summary execution in the aftermath of battle was not justice. Before anyone could debate the point further, Terran Ju arrived. The Shadowpan Lord, recovered from his wounds, had followed the assault with what forces he could gather. He had his own claim on Garrosh, his own people's grievances to represent. Garrosh's crimes had affected many peoples, Terran Ju declared, most of all the Pandaren. The Vale of Eternal Blossoms lay in ruins. The Golden Lotus were dead. Thousands of years of sacred tradition had been destroyed. If anyone had the right to judge Garrosh, it was those he had wronged most directly. He proposed that Garrosh be taken to Pandaria for trial. There, representatives of all the affected peoples could present their grievances. Justice could be done properly, publicly, in a manner that would leave no doubt about the legitimacy of the outcome. Varian agreed. Thrall reluctantly lowered his weapon. Garrosh would stand trial. But before the former warchief was led away, there was the matter of succession. The Horde needed leadership, and Vol'jin's rebellion had been the catalyst that made the siege possible. Thrall spoke first. He addressed the assembled Horde leaders, the warriors who had fought against Garrosh, the peoples who had been oppressed under his rule. The Horde needed its true warchief back, Thrall said. But he was not speaking of himself. Vol'jin had led the rebellion. Vol'jin had united the disparate factions of the Horde against Garrosh. Vol'jin had reached out to the Alliance when others would have let pride prevent cooperation. If anyone had earned the right to lead, it was the Darkspear chieftain. The assembled Horde leaders agreed. Bane Bloodhoof, whose father had died because of Garrosh. Lor'themar Theron, whose people had been marginalized and persecuted. Even Sylvanas Windrunner, who trusted no one, gave her assent. Vol'jin would be warchief. For the first time in the Horde's history, a non-orc would lead. It was a profound statement about what the Horde had become, about what it aspired to be. Vol'jin accepted the responsibility with characteristic humility, promising to lead the Horde not as a conqueror, but as a guardian of all its peoples. Varian watched this transition with calculating eyes. The Alliance forces still surrounded Orgrimmar. The Horde was weakened, its leadership in flux, its military depleted by the siege and the civil war that had preceded it. Jaina stood at his side, urging him to press the advantage, to end the Horde threat once and for all while they had the chance. Varian considered it. He had the power to try. But at what cost? The Alliance was exhausted too. A renewed war would devastate both sides. And more than that, he had seen something during the siege that gave him pause. He had seen Alliance and Horde fighting side by side. He had seen what could be accomplished when the factions worked together instead of against each other. He made his choice. He approached Vol'jin, the new war chief, and delivered a message that was both warning and offer. The Horde had committed crimes under Garrosh that could not be forgotten. The destruction of Theramore, the devastation of the Vale, the countless smaller atrocities that had marked Garrosh's reign. These things demanded response, demanded consequence. But Varian was willing to give peace a chance. He was willing to see if the Horde under Vol'jin would be different from the Horde under Garrosh. He was willing to let the trial in Pandaria proceed, to let justice take its course rather than imposing vengeance. However, he made one thing absolutely clear. If the Horde ever again became what it had been under Garrosh, if it ever again threatened the Alliance with the kind of unprovoked aggression and atrocity that had characterized the fallen Warchief's reign, then there would be no more chances. The Alliance would end the Horde completely and permanently. It was not forgiveness. It was not even true peace. It was a ceasefire, a probationary period during which the Horde would have to prove itself worthy of continued existence. But it was more than many had expected, more than some thought the Horde deserved. Vol'jin accepted the terms. He had no illusions about the difficulty of what lay ahead. He had to rebuild the Horde, heal the wounds that Garrosh had inflicted both externally and internally. He had to prove that the Horde could be a force for honor rather than conquest. It would be the work of years, perhaps decades, but it was better than the alternative. It was better than extinction. Garrosh's trial was held at the Temple of the White Tiger in northern Pandaria. The location was chosen deliberately. The temple was a sacred site watched over by Shuin, the White Tiger, one of the 4 August Celestials who guarded Pandaria. It was a place of strength and justice, where the laws of the Pandaren could be applied to crimes that had affected their homeland more than any other. Terran Zhu presided as judge, a position he had insisted upon given the devastation that Garrosh had wrought upon the Vale of Eternal Blossoms. The Shadow Pan Lord had nearly died at Garrosh's hands, had watched as everything his order had protected for generations was destroyed in moments of selfish ambition. He was determined to see justice done, but he was also committed to doing it properly, to ensuring that whatever verdict was reached could not be questioned. The August Celestials, the great spirits who watched over Pandaria, served as the jury. Zhuan the White Tiger, Chiji the Red Crane, Niu Zhao, the Black Ox, and Yulan the Jade Serpent would weigh the evidence and render judgment. These beings had existed since before recorded history, had witnessed countless crimes and countless acts of heroism. They could not be deceived by clever arguments or emotional manipulation. They would see the truth. Representatives of every major faction were present to witness justice being done. King Varian Rin represented the Alliance, his son Anduin at his side, despite the prince's still healing injuries. Vol'jin represented the Horde as its new warchief, with Bane Bloodhoof and other leaders present to show their support for the process. The Bronze Dragon Kairos was there as well, serving as a neutral observer and providing a unique artifact that would ensure the accuracy of all testimony. The prosecution was led by Tyrande Whisperwind, who had been chosen by the Alliance to present their case. The ancient night elf leader was a priestess of Elune and had millennia of experience in matters of justice and judgment. She was also personally invested in seeing Garrosh punished, as many night elves had died in the conflicts he had started, and the elven city of Darnassus had been violated when Horde agents stole the divine bell. Tyrande brought witness after witness, presented evidence of atrocity after atrocity: the destruction of Theramore, the experiments with the divine bell, the attack on Prince Anduin, the corruption of the Vale, the creation of the true Horde, and its campaign of oppression. Each charge was substantiated with testimony, with physical evidence, with records and reports that documented exactly what Garrosh had done. Survivors of Theramore described the horror of the mana bomb, the way their friends and comrades had simply ceased to exist in a flash of arcane light. Pandaren, who had witnessed the Vale's corruption, spoke of the golden flowers withering, of the sacred pools turning black, of the spirits of the golden lotus being torn from their bodies and bound to eternal torment. Members of the Horde who had suffered under Garrosh's rule testified about the oppression, the arrests, the executions of those who had dared to speak against the Warchief. The defense, surprisingly, was led by Bane Bloodhoof. The Tauren High Chieftain had no love for Garrosh, bore him personal enmity for the death of his father Cairn. But Bane believed in justice, believed that even the guilty deserved proper representation. Someone had to speak for Garrosh, to ensure that the trial was not merely a formality before a predetermined execution. If the proceedings were to have any legitimacy, the accused needed an advocate. Bane argued that Garrosh's actions, while terrible, needed to be understood in context. He pointed to Thrall's role in elevating Garrosh beyond his capabilities, in placing the burdens of leadership upon shoulders that were not ready to bear them. He suggested that some responsibility lay with those who had enabled Garrosh's worst impulses rather than challenging them, who had followed orders they knew were wrong rather than standing against them. The trial was documented in extensive detail through the novel War Crimes, which recorded the proceedings for posterity. Key witnesses included figures like Anduin Wrynn, who testified about his near-death experience at Garrosh's hands, describing the moment when the divine bell had crashed down upon him and shattered his body. The prince's testimony was delivered calmly, without malice, which made it all the more powerful. He did not seek vengeance. He sought only the truth. Various soldiers and civilians who had suffered under the Warchief's rule also testified. Orcish grunts who had been forced to participate in atrocities they did not believe in. Tauren who had watched their spiritual traditions mocked and dismissed. Blood elves who had lost family members in the purge of Dalaran. Each testimony added another stone to the mountain of evidence against Garrosh. The bronze dragons Kairos and Chromie used the vision of time to display accurate representations of past events, ensuring that there could be no dispute about what had actually happened. The vision was a powerful artifact that could show the truth of any moment in history, rendering witness testimony unnecessary in many cases. The audience in the temple saw Theramore's destruction with their own eyes, watched the mana bomb fall, experienced the horror as if they had been there themselves. No amount of argument could counter the evidence of their own senses. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Garrosh had no remorse. He viewed his actions as justified, as necessary for the advancement of the Orcish race. He believed that strength was the only virtue, that the weak existed to serve the strong. He had no regrets about Theramore, about the Vale, about any of it. The August Celestials deliberated, withdrawing to consider all they had heard and seen during the trial. The waiting was tense. Many who had suffered under Garrosh's rule wanted him dead, wanted to see his body displayed as a warning to any who might follow his path. Jaina Proudmoore, in particular, had argued passionately for execution, her grief over Theramore still raw, despite the time that had passed. Others, particularly among the Pandaren themselves, believed that death was too easy, that true justice required something more than simple execution. Their verdict, when it came, was not what anyone expected. The Celestials determined that Garrosh was guilty of his crimes beyond any shadow of doubt. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony undeniable, the images from the vision of time impossible to refute. But they also determined that the appropriate punishment was not death. Instead, he should be given a chance at redemption, an opportunity to make amends for what he had done. The Celestials believed in the possibility of reform, believed that even the most fallen could find their way back to the light if given sufficient time and guidance. This was the Pandaren way. This verdict was controversial, to say the least. Many among both Alliance and Horde felt that justice was not being served. Garrosh himself seemed to view the sentence with contempt, sneering at what he saw as weakness disguised as mercy. Before the sentence could be carried out, Garrosh escaped. The bronze dragon Kairos, who had been working toward his own mysterious ends throughout the trial, revealed his true purpose. He had been using the vision of time not merely to display past events, but to gather power from it, preparing for a moment when he could bend time itself to his will. In a single shocking act, Kairos shattered the vision and used its power to open a portal to another timeline. Garrosh's remaining loyalists, who had been planning this moment for weeks, stormed the Temple of the White Tiger. Warlord Zayla and her Dragonmaw orcs attacked on drakes, provided by the infinite dragonflight, those bronze dragons who had been corrupted and who sought to alter the timeline for their own dark purposes. The assembled dignitaries scattered in confusion as combat erupted in what had been a solemn judicial proceeding. The bronze dragon freed the former warchief and transported him through time to an alternate version of Draenor, 35 years in the past. Kairos believed he could use Garrosh to create armies across infinite timelines, forces that could be used to defend Azeroth against the Burning Legion. His plan was ambitious, but ultimately flawed, for he failed to account for Garrosh's nature. The former warchief did not want to be anyone's tool. When they arrived on the alternate Draenor, Garrosh turned on Kairos. He killed the bronze dragon with a shard of the shattered vision of time, refusing to be manipulated any further. Then he set about his own plan. He would warn his father Grommash about the burning legions, manipulation, preventing the Orcish clans from drinking Manaroth's blood. He would create a horde untainted by demonic corruption, a horde that owed its power to Orcish strength rather than borrowed evil. This created the Iron Horde, an army of orcs who had never been corrupted by demon blood, but who were united under Garrosh's vision of conquest. When Manaroth appeared before the assembled clans, offering his blood as he had in the original timeline, this Garrosh Hellscream refused. Garrosh had warned him of what would come, had shown him glimpses of the future that the demon blood would bring. Instead of drinking, Grommash struck Manaroth down, proving that the orcs did not need demonic power to be strong. Using technology provided by the Blackfuse Company members who had escaped with him through time, Garrosh armed this new horde with weapons and war machines that the original orcs had never possessed. Iron stars rolled across the battlefield, crushing everything in their path. Siege engines that would have taken Azeroth's engineers decades to develop were mass-produced in goblin foundries. The orcish clans who joined the Iron Horde found themselves equipped with weapons more advanced than anything they had ever imagined. The clans united under Grommash's banner. The War Song, the Blackrock, the Bleeding Hollow, the Shattered Hand, the Burning Blade, the Thunderlord, and others all pledged themselves to the Iron Horde. Each clan brought its own strengths. The Blackrock were master smiths whose forges could produce weapons and armor in vast quantities. The Bleeding Hollow were fierce warriors who fought without fear of death. The Shattered Hand were assassins and spies who could eliminate threats before they materialized. Together, they formed an army that would have crushed the original horde that invaded Azeroth. The Iron Horde's invasion of Azeroth through the Dark Portal sparked the events of the Warlords of Draenor expansion. The portal itself had been transformed, connected not to Outland, but to this alternate past Draenor. Iron Horde soldiers poured through, establishing a beachhead in the blasted lands and threatening to sweep across the eastern kingdoms. Alliance and Horde forces had to travel to this alternate Draenor to stop Garrosh's new army before it could overwhelm their world. The campaign on Draenor was long and costly. The heroes of Azeroth found themselves facing opponents who had all of the orcs' natural strength and ferocity, combined with technology that matched or exceeded their own. The Iron Horde had built fortresses across Draenor, had established supply lines and manufacturing centers, had created a war machine that seemed unstoppable. But Garrosh's alliance with his father was uneasy from the start. Grommash was a proud warlord who did not appreciate being told what to do, even by his own son from another timeline. The elder Hellscream had united the clans through his own strength and charisma, had killed Manaroth with his own hands. He viewed himself as the true leader of the Iron Horde, not this stranger who claimed to be his offspring. The Iron Horde began to fracture as various clan leaders pursued their own agendas, as Garrosh's influence waned and Grommash asserted his own authority. Eventually, as the Iron Horde crumbled under the combined assault of Azeroth's forces and its own internal divisions, Garrosh found himself increasingly marginalized. He had created this army, had provided the technology and the warning that had prevented the demonic corruption, but his father had taken credit for everything. Grommash was the war chief. Garrosh was just an advisor, a strange figure from another time whose usefulness had largely expired. Garrosh retreated to Nagrand, the same region where he had spent his youth wallowing in shame. He established himself in Grommashar, a fortress named after his father, and prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Thrall tracked him there, determined to end what he had started when he elevated Garrosh to power. The former war chief of the Horde had failed to stop Garrosh at the Siege of Orgrimmar, had failed to prevent his escape, and had watched as his mistake created an entirely new threat to Azeroth. He would not fail again. Garrosh challenged Thrall to a Mak'gora. It was a traditional orcish challenge, a duel to the death that would settle their conflict once and for all. Per ancient tradition, they would fight alone at a place of Garrosh's choosing. That place was the Stones of Prophecy, the very spot where Thrall had once told Garrosh the truth about his father's redemption. There was a bitter irony in the location, a cruel reminder of how far things had fallen since that hopeful day when a young orc had learned that his father was a hero rather than a villain. The confrontation began with words before it became violence. Garrosh blamed Thrall for everything. He accused the former warchief of setting him up to fail, of putting him in a position of power he was not ready for, of abandoning him to deal with problems that were not his own making. He reminded Thrall of all the warnings that had been ignored, of all the advice that had been rejected, of how Thrall had pushed him forward, despite every indication that he was not suited for the role he was being given. There was some truth to the accusations. Thrall had made Garrosh warchief despite the warnings of Vol'jin, despite the concerns of Cairn Bloodhoof, despite the doubts expressed by many who knew the young Hellscream better than Thrall did. He had left to join the Earthen Ring at a critical moment, abandoning the Horde to Garrosh's leadership, just as the Cataclysm was creating chaos across the world. He had not provided the guidance and support that Garrosh had needed, had not been there to temper the young warchief's worst impulses with wisdom and experience. But Thrall rejected the premise of Garrosh's argument. Yes, he had made mistakes. Yes, he bore some responsibility for what the Horde had become under Garrosh's leadership. But Garrosh's choices were his own. No one had forced him to destroy Theramore with a mana bomb. No one had forced him to experiment with the Divine Bell or corrupt the Vale of Eternal Blossoms. No one had forced him to create the true Horde or ally with the servants of Y'Sharj, or flee through time to create an entirely new army. Those had been Garrosh's decisions, made freely by a grown orc who was responsible for his own actions, and he would answer for them. They fought a Mak'gora, a traditional orcish duel to the death. The rules of such duels were ancient and sacred, established in the earliest days of orcish civilization. Each combatant was permitted a single weapon, blessed by the elements if they were a shaman. Armor was permitted but not required. The duel would continue until one combatant yielded or died. There was to be no fleeing, no outside interference, no calling for help. It was supposed to be a test of personal combat, warrior against warrior, the purest form of conflict resolution that orcish culture recognized. Garrosh came to the duel with Gorehowl, the legendary axe that had been his father's weapon, the blade that had slain Manaroth and freed the orcs from their demonic blood curse. It was fitting that he would fight his final battle with this weapon, that the axe of the Hellscream line would determine whether that line would continue. Garrosh was a powerful warrior in his own right, trained from youth in the arts of combat, his strength and skill honed through countless battles across 2 worlds. He had no fear of Thrall, believed himself the superior fighter. Thrall came with the Doomhammer, the weapon of the first Warchief Orgrimm Doomhammer, passed down to Thrall as the symbol of his leadership of the Horde. But Thrall was also a shaman, perhaps the most powerful shaman the orcs had ever produced. His connection to the elements was legendary. He had used that connection to help save the world during the Cataclysm, had communed with spirits that most shamans could barely comprehend. The question that hung over the duel was whether he would use those powers. The combat began with pure physical confrontation. Gorehowl clashed against the Doomhammer again and again, the ring of metal on metal echoing across the Nagrand hills. Garrosh was the stronger of the two, his blows forcing Thrall back step by step across the rocky terrain. The former warchief pressed his advantage, sensing weakness, smelling blood. He had always believed he was the superior warrior, and now he was proving it with every exchange of blows. But Thrall was not merely a warrior. As the duel progressed, as Garrosh's brute strength began to overwhelm him, as it became clear that he could not win through physical prowess alone, Thrall called upon the elements. It was a decision that would haunt him for years to come, that would change his relationship with the spirits he had served his entire life. Lightning struck Garrosh, channeled through Thrall's will. The bolt came from a clear sky, summoned by a shaman who had decided that winning was more important than fighting fair. Garrosh staggered under the assault, his muscles spasming from the electric shock, his grip on Gorehowl momentarily weakened. Before he could recover, the earth itself rose up to crush him. Stone hands emerged from the ground, grasping Garrosh, holding him in place while Thrall delivered the killing blow with the Doomhammer. It was not a clean victory, not a pure test of martial skill. Some would later argue that Thrall had violated the spirit of the Mak'gora by using his shamanic powers. The rules technically permitted weapons blessed by the elements, but calling upon the elements directly during combat was a different matter entirely. Garrosh, in his final moments, accused Thrall of cheating, of proving through his actions that he could not win through his own strength, that he was weak despite all his pretensions of leadership. Thrall did not care about the accusations in that moment. Garrosh was dead. The threat he represented was ended. The cycle of violence that had begun when Thrall made his fateful choice to elevate Garrosh to power was finally broken. The former warchief who had destroyed Theramore, corrupted the Vale, created the true Horde, escaped justice, and built the Iron Horde would never threaten anyone again. His body lay broken on the Nagrand stones, held in the grip of the very earth he had once walked. But the victory came at a cost that Thrall had not anticipated. His relationship with the elements was damaged by what he had done. They had answered his call during the Mak'gora, had served as weapons in what was supposed to be a test of personal combat, but there was hesitation in their response that had not existed before. The elements were not tools to be used for personal vengeance. They were partners, spiritual beings who worked with shamans for the good of the world. Thrall had used them for something else, and they knew it. In the years that followed, Thrall would struggle to reconnect with the spirits he had served his entire life. During the Burning Legion's invasion of Azeroth, when his shamanic powers were needed more than ever before, he found himself unable to call upon them with the confidence he once had. The elements responded to him, but reluctantly, uncertainly. They doubted him as he had begun to doubt himself. Eventually, Thrall passed the Doomhammer to another shaman, admitting that he was no longer worthy to wield it. The price of killing Garrosh had been higher than the death itself. Garrosh's soul was consigned to the Shadowlands, the realm of death that awaits all mortal beings when their time on Azeroth ends. Because of his crimes, because of the unrepentant nature of his sins, He was sent to Revendreth, a realm where sinful souls are punished and potentially redeemed through the attention of the Venthyr. This dark realm was designed to break the pride of the guilty, to make them acknowledge their wrongs, to prepare them for whatever afterlife they had earned. But Garrosh proved resistant to rehabilitation. His pride, his conviction that he had been right, remained unbroken despite everything the Venthyr could do. He refused to acknowledge that his actions had been wrong. He insisted that he had served his people, that everything he had done was justified by the results he had sought to achieve. The fact that those results had never materialized, that his dreams had ended in failure and death, did not shake his certainty. Garrosh Hellscream would not bend, would not break, would not admit that he had been anything other than what his people needed. Eventually, he ended up in the Maw, the worst fate possible in the Shadowlands, a prison for souls deemed irredeemable by any means. This was the realm of the Jailer, a place of eternal torment, where souls were stripped of hope and meaning, where existence became an endless cycle of suffering with no possibility of escape. There, Garrosh remained until the events of the Shadowlands expansion, when adventurers traveling through the halls of Torghast encountered him once again. Even in death, even after all the suffering he had endured, Garrosh was unchanged. When confronted by champions of both Alliance and Horde, when faced with the opportunity to acknowledge his crimes and seek atonement, he refused. He looked upon those who had defeated him in life and declared that he would make the same choices again, that he regretted nothing. His pride remained unbroken. His conviction remained absolute. He was Garrosh Hellscream, and he had done what needed to be done. His soul was finally destroyed, ending his existence completely. The orc who had dreamed of glory, who had risen from shame to power and from power to tyranny, was no more. Not even his spirit remained to carry on. Garrosh Hellscream was gone, truly and completely, erased from existence as thoroughly as the city of Theramore had been erased by his mana bomb. The Siege of Orgrimmar marked the end of an era for the Horde and for Azeroth. It demonstrated that there were limits to what the factions would tolerate, that tyranny and atrocity would be opposed, even if it meant former enemies working together. The sight of Alliance and Horde soldiers fighting side by side in the tunnels beneath Orgrimmar was something that few had ever expected to see. For a brief moment, the endless cycle of war between the factions was broken, replaced by a common purpose and a shared enemy. In the immediate aftermath of the siege, there was a considerable debate about what should happen next. Some among the Alliance, particularly Jaina Proudmoore, argued that this was the moment to finish the Horde completely. The Orcish capital lay open. The Warchief was defeated. The Horde's armies were scattered and demoralized. A decisive strike now could end the threat forever, could prevent future Garroshs from ever rising to power. King Varian Wrynn faced the most important decision of his reign. The High King of the Alliance stood in the ruins of Garrosh's throne room, surrounded by the evidence of the Warchief's corruption, and he chose mercy. He declared that the Horde would be allowed to continue, that Vol'jin would be recognized as its new leader, that peace between the factions was possible if both sides were willing to work for it. The war would end here, in the depths of Orgrimmar, rather than continuing until one side or the other was exterminated. Not everyone agreed with Varian's choice. Jaina, in particular, was furious, seeing it as a betrayal of all those who had died at Theramore. She stormed out of the chamber, her relationship with the Alliance leadership fractured. Others worried that the decision was merely postponing the inevitable, that the Horde would eventually produce another Garrosh, and the cycle would repeat. But Varian held firm. He had seen what total war led to. He had watched his own kingdom suffer through it during the First and Second Wars. He would not inflict that suffering on others if there was any alternative. The prisoners who had been held in Orgrimmar's dungeons were freed. Many were Horde citizens who had spoken against Garrosh, who had refused to participate in his atrocities, who had been thrown into cells for the crime of disagreeing with their warchief. They emerged from their imprisonment, pale and weakened, blinking in the light of the surface, barely able to comprehend that their ordeal was finally over. The reunion scenes between these prisoners and their families were heartbreaking to witness. So much had been lost, so many years stolen, so many relationships damaged beyond repair. The Korkron who had survived the siege faced their own reckoning. Some were deemed war criminals who had participated willingly in Garrosh's worst actions, who had carried out atrocities with enthusiasm rather than reluctance. These were imprisoned or executed, depending on the severity of their crimes. Others were shown mercy, particularly those who could demonstrate that they had been following orders under duress, that they had tried to minimize harm when they could. The line between complicity and coercion was not always clear, and many difficult judgments had to be made. Vol'jin's tenure as warchief was relatively brief, but profoundly significant. The troll who had led the Darkspear Rebellion, who had united the Horde's disparate races against Garrosh's tyranny, now had to lead them in peace. It was a different kind of challenge than war, requiring different skills and different approaches. Vol'jin proved equal to the task. He worked to rebuild trust between the Horde's constituent races, to heal the wounds that Garrosh had inflicted on the bonds between them. The Tauren, the Blood Elves, the Trolls, the Forsaken, and even those orcs who had opposed Garrosh needed to believe that the Horde could be something better than what it had become under the previous warchief. Vol'jin listened to all of them, traveled to each of their homelands, showed through his actions that every voice in the Horde mattered equally. He proved that non-orc leadership could work, that the Horde was more than its founding race. Some orcs grumbled at first, uncomfortable with a troll sitting on the throne that Thrall had built for orcish leaders. But Vol'jin won them over through the same qualities that had made him such an effective rebel leader. His wisdom, his courage, his genuine concern for all who served under him. He was not trying to make the Horde into the Darkspear tribe writ large. He was trying to make it into a true coalition where every race contributed and every race benefited. When the Burning Legion returned during the events of the Legion expansion, Vol'jin led the Horde forces against the demonic invasion. The assault on the Broken Shore was supposed to be a coordinated strike, Alliance and Horde working together as they had during the Siege of Orgrimmar. But the demons were prepared for them. They had anticipated the attack and turned what should have been a victory into a devastating trap. Vol'jin was mortally wounded during the battle, struck down by a demon's blade that carried poison no healer could counter. The wound was not immediately fatal, but there was nothing that could be done to save him. As he lay dying aboard the retreating Horde fleet, he received a vision from the Loa spirits that had guided him throughout his life. With his dying breath, he named Sylvanas Windrunner as his successor, claiming that the Loa had shown him this was destiny, that the Banshee Queen was meant to lead the Horde through the trials to come. The wisdom of that choice would be debated for years to come. Sylvanas's reign brought its own challenges, its own controversies, its own eventual reckoning at the gates of Orgrimmar when a different coalition rose against a different tyrant. But that is a story for another time, a continuation of the cycle of power and corruption that seems to define the Horde's tumultuous history. The Siege of Orgrimmar remains a pivotal moment in Azeroth's history, studied by historians and military strategists alike for the lessons it offers about the nature of power, the dangers of corruption, and the possibility of cooperation between traditional enemies. It proved that peace between Alliance and Horde was possible, even if only temporary and born of necessity. It showed that internal threats could be as dangerous as external ones, that the enemy within could be more devastating than any outside force. It demonstrated that power corrupts, that ambition unchecked by wisdom leads inevitably to destruction and ruin. The military aspects of the siege alone made it worthy of study for generations to come. The coordination between ground and naval forces, the penetration of a heavily defended city, the progressive clearing of entrenched positions, all of these required levels of planning and execution that would serve as models for future campaigns. The commanders who led the assault learned lessons about combined arms warfare that they would carry with them throughout their careers, lessons about the integration of magical and conventional forces, about the management of diverse armies with different traditions and different expectations. The political implications were equally significant and far-reaching. The siege demonstrated that the Alliance and Horde could work together when facing a common enemy, but it also revealed the fragility of such cooperation. The debates that followed about whether to destroy the Horde entirely, about whether to impose punitive terms on the defeated faction, about how to handle war criminals and collaborators, all of these echoed through subsequent years of Azerothian politics. When Sylvanas Windrunner eventually pushed the Horde toward another conflict with the Alliance, many pointed to the Siege of Orgrimmar as a missed opportunity, a moment when the cycle of violence might have been broken permanently if only different choices had been made. Garrosh Hellscream's legacy remains complex to this day, defying simple characterization as hero or villain. He was a product of his circumstances, shaped first by the shame of his father's supposed dishonor, then by the fierce pride that replaced that shame when he learned the truth of Gromish's sacrifice. He was never taught moderation, never given the tools to balance ambition with wisdom. Thrall saw potential in him, but failed to nurture it properly, failed to provide the guidance and mentorship that might have prevented the tragedy to come. The other Horde leaders saw the danger in him early, but failed to challenge him effectively until it was far too late. He genuinely believed he was serving his people, that his visions of orcish supremacy would lead to a better future for all orcs, even if others had to suffer in the process. In his own mind, he was the continuation of his father's legacy, the warrior who would lead the horde to the glory it deserved after centuries of hardship and humiliation. The other races were not truly his enemies in his view. They were simply obstacles to be overcome or tools to be used in pursuit of that greater goal. The suffering he caused was regrettable but necessary, the price of creating the world he envisioned. But his methods were monstrous, his actions unforgivable by any reasonable standard of morality. The mana bomb that destroyed Theramore killed thousands of innocent people who had done nothing to deserve such a horrific fate. The corruption of the Vale of Eternal Blossoms was a crime against nature itself, a desecration of sacred ground that had been protected for millennia. The oppression of non-orc races within his own horde violated the very principles that the horde had been founded upon, the ideals of unity and mutual respect that Thrall had championed. He destroyed far more than he built, killed far more than he protected, corrupted far more than he purified. The Vale of Eternal Blossoms took years to heal from his depredations. The golden fields that had bloomed for centuries withered under the Shah corruption, and even after the heart of Y'Sharj was destroyed, the land required careful and constant tending to recover. The Golden Lotus Pandaren, who had died defending the Vale, were mourned and remembered, their sacrifice honored by those who came after. Eventually, the flowers bloomed again, the pools ran clear once more, but the memory of what had been lost remained sharp in the minds of all who had witnessed the destruction. The scars Garrosh left on the relationships between horde races took even longer to heal, if they ever truly healed at all. The Tauren remembered how their spiritual traditions had been mocked, how their voices had been dismissed, how Bane's father Cairn had died in a duel tainted by Magatha's treachery. The Blood Elves remembered the persecution in Dalaran, the deaths that had resulted from Garrosh's scheming with the Sun Reavers. The Trolls remembered the oppression, the martial law, the way their people had been treated as enemies in their own capital city. The Forsaken remembered how close they had come to being purged when Garrosh deemed them unworthy of belonging to the horde he was building. Some argue that these wounds never fully healed, that the divisions Garrosh created contributed directly to the conflicts that followed under Sylvanas' leadership. The lack of trust between the races, the suspicion that any leader might become another tyrant, the reluctance to fully commit to the Horde's unity when doing so might mean suffering again at the hands of a corrupt leader. All of these could be traced back to the trauma of Garrosh's reign. He had poisoned the well of cooperation, and that poison lingered long after he was gone. But the siege also showed what was possible when old hatreds were set aside, when former enemies chose to stand together against a common threat. Alliance and Horde soldiers fought and died together in those tunnels beneath Orgrimmar, standing shoulder to shoulder against foes that neither could have defeated alone. They bled the same red blood, faced the same dangers, mourned the same losses. Human and orc, night elf and blood elf, dwarf and tauren, all of them worked together with a unity of purpose that had seemed impossible just years before. For a brief shining moment, they were not enemies but allies, not rivals but partners in a shared struggle. They shared rations around campfires during the lulls between battles. They helped each other tend wounds. They celebrated victories together and grieved losses together. Some formed friendships that transcended the faction divide, bonds that would endure even when the political situation deteriorated once again. The experience changed many of those who participated in profound ways, giving them a different perspective on the people they had been taught to hate. That unity did not last, of course. The faction conflict resumed eventually, as it always seems to in the world of Azeroth. The hatreds run too deep, the grievances too numerous, for permanent peace to be easily achieved. The leaders on both sides found it convenient to have an enemy to rally against, found that pointing to the other faction was easier than addressing the difficult problems within their own societies. The momentum toward reconciliation that the siege had created was gradually dissipated by smaller conflicts, by provocations real and imagined, by the endless cycle of action and reaction that defines the relationship between Alliance and Horde. But the memory of what was achieved during the siege remained. Veterans of the campaign remembered fighting alongside their former enemies. They remembered that cooperation was possible, that the hatred was not inevitable, that another way existed even if the will to pursue it was lacking. That memory would be called upon again in future crises, when the world faced threats that demanded the same kind of unity that had brought down Garrosh Hellscream. The heart of Y'Sharj is gone now, its power fully expended and dissipated into the void from which it came. The last physical remnant of the old god that once terrorized Pandaria has finally passed from existence, its whispers silenced forever. The Shah that plagued the continent for millennia have been largely contained, reduced to manageable manifestations that the Pandaren have learned to handle through their traditional practices of balance and meditation. The cycle of corruption that Y'Sharj began so long ago has finally truly ended. Pandaria itself has recovered, slowly but surely, from the wounds that the war between Alliance and Horde inflicted upon it. The Pandaren have rebuilt what was destroyed, healed what was wounded, restored what was corrupted. The Vale of Eternal Blossoms blooms once again with the golden flowers that give it its name, though the memory of its desecration has not faded and likely never will. The golden lotus tends the sacred pools as their predecessors did for countless generations, carrying on traditions that nearly ended under Garrosh's assault, but have proven more resilient than even the worst darkness could destroy. The champions who fought in the siege have gone on to other battles, other challenges, other threats that demanded their courage and their strength. The enemies of Azeroth never rest, never cease their plotting and scheming. The Burning Legion, the Void Lords, the cosmic forces that eye the world with hunger and malice, all demand constant vigilance from those who would protect it. But those champions carry with them the lessons of Orgrimmar. They know that the greatest threats can come from within as easily as from without. They know that power must be matched by wisdom, that strength without conscience leads only to destruction. They know that even the mightiest can fall if they lose sight of what truly matters, if they sacrifice their principles for power or their honor for victory. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of World of Warcraft's most significant events. The Siege of Orgrimmar was more than a raid, more than a military campaign. It was a story of corruption and redemption, of pride and humility, of the terrible cost of unchecked ambition and the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. If you enjoyed this exploration of Warcraft lore, please like this video and subscribe to World of Sleepcraft. Your support helps us continue creating these deep dives into the stories that make Azeroth such a rich and fascinating world. Leave a comment below sharing your memories of the Siege of Orgrimmar, your thoughts on Garrosh's legacy, or suggestions for future episodes. Until next time, may your sleep be peaceful and your dreams be filled with adventure. Good night.